come on, you're almost there!" The crowd roared from both sides of the course as thousands of spectators rose to their feet. Fiora staggered forward, each step heavier than the last. After 50 grueling kilometers, her legs no longer felt like they belonged to her. Every breath burned, every muscle begged her to stop. No one could have imagined that the skinny little girl who had once been abandoned by her father was now only 100 meters away from becoming the first woman in history to win the Blue Ridge Endurance Marathon overall. She gritted her teeth and forced herself to keep moving, one painful step after another. Behind her, the runners chasing her were getting closer. Suddenly, through the deafening roar of the crowd, she heard a voice she knew better than any other. "Come on, sweetheart. You can do it." Fiora turned her head. For the briefest moment, she caught a glimpse of her mother standing beside the course. Mary, the woman who had passed away a year earlier. The woman who had been her coach, her greatest supporter, and her constant companion through every step of this journey. Whether it was a dream or simply her exhausted mind, Fiora didn't know. But in that instant, it felt as though her mother was running beside her once again. A surge of strength filled her exhausted body. She pushed herself forward, half running, half stumbling, tears streaming down her face. Over and over, she whispered through trembling lips, "Mom, Mom, please watch me. I'm going to make you proud." 100 meters, 50, 20, 10, 5, 1. At last, Fiora crossed the finish line first. She collapsed onto the pavement, crying tears of pure joy. Not because she had become a champion, not because she had made history, but because she had finally kept the promise she made to her mother before she passed away. Looking up at the sky through tear-filled eyes, she smiled and whispered, "Mom, I'm a champion now." Mary had waited 9 long months to meet her baby girl. When Fiora finally cried for the first time, she smiled through exhausted tears. But the smile didn't last. The delivery room grew strangely quiet as the pediatrician continued examining the newborn. "Is something wrong?" Mary asked, trying to sit up. The doctor walked over with the baby wrapped in a white blanket. "Your daughter is breathing well," he said gently. "But she was born with a rare congenital condition that will affect her physical development. There's a good chance she won't grow or move like other children her age." Mary looked at Dion. He hadn't taken his eyes off the baby. "Will she ever be able to live a normal life?" he finally asked. The doctor didn't rush his answer. "We don't know. Some children surprise us. Others need help for the rest of their lives." The room fell silent. Mary held out her arms. "Can I hold my daughter?" A nurse carefully placed Fiora in her arms. She was so tiny that Mary's hands almost covered her entire body. Fiora slowly wrapped her little fingers around one of Mary's. Mary smiled and kissed her forehead. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she whispered. "Mom and Dad are right here. You're going to grow up healthy and beautiful, just like every other little girl." Dion looked away and rubbed the back of his neck. He wanted to believe her. He just couldn't. Mary looked down at Fiora again and gently stroked the baby's cheek. "We'll figure everything out together, okay? One step at a time." By the time Fiora started 3rd grade, she already knew where to sit if she wanted to eat lunch alone. It was the last table near the cafeteria windows, where no one had to look at her unless they wanted to. Every morning, Mary packed her a small lunch before leaving for work. A peanut butter sandwich, a banana, and a bottle of water. It wasn't much, but Mary always slipped a little handwritten note into the lunch bag. "Have a wonderful day, sweetheart. Love you." Fiora never threw those notes away. She folded every single one and kept them inside an old cookie tin under her bed. One afternoon, a group of girls walked past her table and whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "Why are her arms so skinny? She looks like she might break if someone hugs her." They laughed as they walked away. Fiora slowly pulled down the sleeves of her oversized hoodie and kept eating without saying a word. After school, she walked home alone like she always did. The neighborhood kids were riding bikes, throwing footballs, and racing down the sidewalk. Fiora slowed her pace every time she passed them. She had gotten used to pretending she didn't hear the comments. When she reached home, Mary was already getting ready for her evening shift. She had changed into a navy blue nursing assistant uniform and was stuffing a peanut butter sandwich into her own lunch bag. Fiora looked inside the refrigerator. There was half a gallon of milk, a carton of eggs, and leftovers from 2 nights ago. "Mom, are we out of groceries again?" Mary smiled as she grabbed her car keys. "Payday's Friday. We'll make it until then. She knelt down, straightened Fiora's backpack, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Besides, we still have eggs. You know how many meals I can make with eggs? Fiora laughed. Probably 100. At least 101, Mary said with a grin before kissing the top of her head and heading out the door. Tyrese was only 3 years older than Fiora, but everyone in the neighborhood treated him like he was already grown. He was taller than most kids his age, fast enough to leave everyone behind on the football field, and never backed away from a fight if he thought someone deserved it. One afternoon, Fiora was walking home, carrying a poster she'd made for school when 3 boys rode past on their bikes. One of them slowed down, looked at her, and laughed. "Hey, skeleton girl!" Another joined in. "Be careful. The wind might blow you away." The poster slipped from Fiora's hands as they circled around her, laughing louder with every lap. Before she could bend down to pick it up, someone grabbed the handlebars of the first bike and shoved it sideways. The boy hit the grass with a loud yelp. Tyrese stood between Fiora and the other kids. "Pick on someone your own size," he said. One of the boys rolled his eyes. "We're just joking." Tyrese took one step closer. "Then joke with me." None of them answered. They picked up the fallen bike and rode away without looking back. Tyrese waited until they disappeared around the corner before turning to Fiora. He picked up the bent poster, brushed the dirt off as best he could, then looked at her scraped knee. "Does it hurt?" Fiora shook her head, even though it did. Tyrese pulled a bandage out of his backpack, knelt on one knee, and carefully covered the scrape. "There." He stood up and handed the poster back to her. "Don't let people who quit that easily tell you who you are." Fiora looked up at him. "Do you really think I can do something special one day?" Tyrese smiled. "I don't think it." He tapped the tip of her nose. "I know it." That evening, the smell of baked chicken and mashed potatoes filled the apartment before Dion came home from work. Dinner was the only time everyone could sit together, no matter how busy the day had been. Tyrese rushed to the table first, still wearing his track team's hoodie. "Coach timed my 100 today," he said excitedly. "I beat my personal record." Dion looked up from washing his hands and smiled. "That's what I'm talking about." He gave Tyrese a proud pat on the shoulder before sitting down. "Keep training like this and you'll have colleges calling before your senior year." Tyrese grinned. "That's the plan." Mary placed everyone's plates on the table. Baked chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and warm cornbread. It wasn't much, but she always tried to make dinner feel special. Fiora listened quietly while everyone talked about Tyrese's practice. She smiled every time he smiled. When the conversation finally slowed, she looked at her father. "Dad? Yeah, sweetheart? Do you think maybe I could learn how to run someday?" Dion didn't answer right away. He looked at Fiora, then at her thin arms resting on the edge of the table. "Honey," he forced a small smile. "Not everybody has to be good at sports." Fiora waited. "Your body's different. Running would only make things harder for you." The smile slowly disappeared from Fiora's face. She lowered her eyes to her plate and quietly broke a piece of cornbread into smaller pieces without taking a bite. Mary looked at Dion. "She didn't ask if she'd win a race," she said. "She asked if she could learn." Dion sighed. "I'm being realistic. You're deciding what she can't do before she's even had the chance to try." Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Tyrese reached across the table, picked up the biggest piece of chicken from his own plate, and placed it onto Fiora's. "You'll need the extra protein if you're going to outrun me one day," he said with a smile. Fiora finally looked up and smiled back, just a little. Dion noticed it. He wanted to say something, but instead he quietly reached for his glass of iced tea. A few minutes later, Fiora carried her plate to the sink. Most of the food was still untouched. Tyrese watched her walk down the hallway before turning back to his father. "Dad!" He stopped himself. Dion already knew what he was about to say. Later that night, Tyrese knocked softly on Fiora's bedroom door. "You still awake?" Fiora looked up from the notebook on her lap. "Come in." Tyrese sat beside her on the floor. "Still thinking about what Dad said?" Fiora shrugged without answering. Tyrese noticed the notebook and reached for it. "Can I see?" Fiora hesitated for a second before handing it over. The pages were filled with small pencil drawings, mountains, trees, a few family portraits, then page after page of people running. Some were crossing finish lines. Others had medals around their necks. Tyrese looked at her and smiled. "You drew all these?" Fiora nodded. "I don't even know why." Tyrese flipped through another page. Looks like somebody wants to be a runner. Fiora laughed quietly. People like me don't become runners. Tyrese closed the notebook and handed it back. Who told you that? Fiora didn't have to answer. They both knew. Tyrese stood up. Come on. Where? Outside. The apartment complex was quiet. A few porch lights were still on, and the parking lot was almost empty. Tyrese pointed toward the sidewalk that stretched past the mailboxes. See that stop sign? Fiora nodded. Let's race to it. Fiora looked down at her legs and shook her head. I'll lose. Probably, Tyrese said with a grin. But that's not the point. Fiora took a deep breath. Okay, ready? She nodded. Go, Tyrese took off, then immediately slowed his pace without letting Fiora notice. She ran as fast as her little legs could carry her. Halfway there, her breathing became heavy. She stopped, bent over, and grabbed her knees. Tyrese jogged back. You quit already? Fiora frowned. I can't. You made it farther than yesterday. I didn't run yesterday. Tyrese smiled. Exactly. Fiora looked at him for a second before laughing. It was the first time she'd laughed all day. Tyrese gently bumped her shoulder. One day, you're gonna beat me, Fiora rolled her eyes. You're making that up. Nope, he pointed at the stop sign. We'll start here. Tomorrow we'll make it to the next one. Early Saturday morning, Tyrese was already dressed before anyone else woke up. His track bag was waiting by the front door, and his spikes hung over one shoulder. Mary walked into the kitchen wearing her robe and smiled when she saw him making himself a bowl of cereal. Big day? She asked. Tyrese nodded. Coach says a scout from Appalachian State might be there. Mary kissed the side of his head. Then you'd better give them something to remember. A few minutes later, Fiora shuffled into the kitchen, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. You're leaving already? She asked. Tyrese looked at the clock. The bus leaves in 30 minutes. Fiora looked disappointed. I wanted to race you today, Tyrese laughed. Rain check. He grabbed his track bag, then walked over and gently tapped the tip of her nose. When I get back, we're running to the second stop sign, Fiora smiled. You promised. I know. Dion came out of the bedroom carrying his truck keys. I'll drive you to school. Tyrese nodded and followed him outside. Before climbing into the truck, he turned back toward the apartment. Mary stood at the doorway with one hand around Fiora's shoulder. Tyrese waved. Fiora waved back with both hands. Don't forget, she shouted. Second stop sign! Tyrese laughed. I won't! The truck pulled away from the curb and disappeared around the corner. Fiora stayed outside for another few seconds before going back inside. She picked up her notebook from the coffee table and drew one more picture. This time there were two runners standing side by side beneath a finish line. She smiled, closed the notebook, and carefully placed it back on the shelf. About 20 minutes later, the phone rang. Mary wiped her hands on a dish towel before answering. Hello? The smile slowly faded from her face. She didn't say a single word. The dish towel slipped from her hand and landed on the kitchen floor. Mary had barely finished washing the breakfast dishes when the phone rang. She wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and answered without thinking. Hello? A calm voice came through the receiver. Is this Mrs. Mary Jefferson? Yes. I'm Officer Hayes with the Asheville Police Department. I'm calling about your son, Tyrese Jefferson. Mary's smile disappeared. She tightened her grip on the phone. What happened? There was an accident involving your son's school bus and a pickup truck on Interstate 240. Mary felt her knees weaken. Is he okay? The officer paused for a moment. Ma'am, your son has been taken to Mission Hospital. We need you and your husband to come as soon as possible. Mary grabbed the edge of the kitchen counter to keep herself from falling. Fiora looked up from the living room floor where she had been coloring. Mom? Mary couldn't answer. The phone slowly slipped away from her ear. Just then the front door opened. Dion walked in carrying his truck keys. Forgot my wallet, he said before noticing Mary's face. What's wrong? Mary handed him the phone with shaking hands. Dion listened quietly. The color drained from his face. We're leaving now, he said before hanging up. He turned toward Fiora and forced himself to stay calm. Mrs. Robinson is going to stay with you for a little while, okay? Fiora looked from her father to her mother. Where's Tyrese? Mary quickly pulled her into a hug. We'll be back soon, sweetheart. It wasn't the answer Fiora wanted. She stood at the front window and watched her parents' truck disappear down the street. For the first time in her life, the apartment felt too quiet. Mission Hospital was crowded with police officers, paramedics, and anxious families. Dion and Mary rushed through the emergency entrance without saying a word. A nurse led them into a private consultation room instead of the waiting area. Mary stopped walking. She already knew what that meant. A doctor stepped inside a few moments later. "We did everything we could." Mary closed her eyes. "No." The doctor lowered his head. "I'm so sorry." Mary covered her mouth as a cry escaped her throat. Dion stood completely still. He stared at the floor for several long seconds before asking in a voice that barely came out, Can we see him?" The doctor nodded. A nurse led them into another room. Tyrese lay peacefully beneath a white sheet. There wasn't a single scrape on his face. He looked as if he were only sleeping after another long day of practice. Mary slowly walked over and brushed a strand of hair away from his forehead. "You promised your sister you'd come home," she whispered. "You promised." Her legs gave out beneath her. Dion caught her before she hit the floor, but he couldn't stop his own tears anymore. He rested one hand on Tyrese's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, son," he whispered. "I should have told you that more often." Neither of them noticed the pair of running shoes sitting neatly beside Tyrese's backpack in the corner of the room. The apartment felt different that night. Nothing had moved. Tyrese's running shoes were still by the front door. His hoodie still hung over the back of the dining chair. His backpack was still leaning against the wall where he had left it that morning. Mary quietly opened the kitchen cabinet and took out 4 dinner plates. She placed the first one on the table, then the second, then the third. When she reached for the 4th plate, her hand stopped. She stared at Tyrese's empty chair for several seconds before slowly putting the plate back into the cabinet. Nobody spoke. Dion sat at the table with his eyes fixed on his plate. The mashed potatoes had already gone cold, but he never picked up his fork. Fiora looked at the empty chair, then back at her mother. "Mom, should I save Tyrese's dinner for when he gets home?" Mary's lips trembled. She turned away and covered her mouth with one hand. Dion suddenly pushed his chair back and walked onto the balcony without saying a word. A few seconds later, Fiora heard something she had never heard before. Her father was crying. She quietly got up from the table and walked down the hallway. Tyrese's bedroom door was still open. His medals hung above the desk. His race bibs were pinned to the wall. His running shoes rested beside the bed, still stained with dried mud from his last practice. Fiora slowly picked up one of the shoes and held it against her chest. "I made it to the 2nd stop sign today," she whispered. "You said we'd run to the next one together." She sat on the edge of his bed and waited as if her brother might answer from the next room. The apartment stayed silent. After a while, Mary walked into the doorway. She didn't say anything. She simply sat beside Fiora, wrapped one arm around her shoulders, and held her close. Mother and daughter stayed there until long after the house had gone dark. 3 days later, friends, neighbors, teachers, and members of Tyrese's track team filled the small church in Asheville. The front row was covered with white lilies. Beside Tyrese's photograph sat a pair of worn running shoes, his school track jacket, and the gold medal he had won just 2 weeks earlier. Fiora couldn't stop looking at the shoes. She kept expecting her brother to walk through the church doors, laugh, and tell everyone there had been some terrible mistake. Coach Daniels stepped up to the podium and took a deep breath. "Most coaches remember an athlete because of how fast they run," he said. "I'll remember Tyrese because he never crossed a finish line without turning around to see if someone else needed help getting there." Several of his teammates lowered their heads. One of them quietly wiped away tears. Coach Daniels smiled through his own. Every afternoon, he'd complain that he couldn't stay late because he had to walk his little sister home from school. He never said it like it was a responsibility. He said it like it was the best part of his day. Fiora lowered her head. Mary reached over and held her hand. After the service ended, people slowly began leaving the church. Some hugged Mary. Others shook Dion's hand without saying a word. When the room was almost empty, Fiora quietly walked to the front. She stood in front of Tyrese's photograph for a long time before reaching for the pair of running shoes. She gently touched one of the laces with her fingertips. "I didn't get to beat you," she whispered with a small smile. "You won again." Mary stood a few steps behind her. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't interrupt. She knew Fiora wasn't talking to a photograph. She was saying goodbye to her brother in the only way she knew how. The weeks after Tyrese's funeral passed more quietly than anyone thought possible. The apartment no longer echoed with laughter or the sound of running shoes hitting the hallway floor. Most evenings, Dion came home from work, changed out of his boots, and sat alone on the balcony until it was time to sleep. Some nights he didn't even touch the dinner Mary left for him. Mary tried to keep life moving. She went to work, paid the bills, helped Fiora with homework, and somehow found the strength to smile whenever her daughter looked at her. But every time she walked past Tyrese's bedroom, she slowed down for just a second before continuing down the hallway. Fiora stopped drawing pictures of finish lines. Instead, she spent hours sitting on her brother's bed, reading the old sports magazines he had collected over the years. One Saturday morning, she opened the closet and found Tyrese's track jacket hanging exactly where he had left it. She slipped it over her shoulders. The sleeves covered her hands, and the jacket almost reached her knees. She stood in front of the bedroom mirror and smiled. "You'd laugh if you saw me," she whispered. Just then, Dion walked past the open door. He stopped when he saw Fiora wearing the jacket. His face tightened. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Fiora looked at him. "Dad." Dion walked into the room, took the jacket off her shoulders, folded it carefully, and placed it back inside the closet. "Don't touch your brother's things again," he said quietly. Fiora lowered her head. "I'm sorry." Dion nodded once and walked out of the room, closing the closet door behind him. Mary had been standing in the hallway long enough to hear everything. She waited until Dion disappeared into the living room before stepping inside. Fiora was still staring at the closed closet. Mary wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "He doesn't mean to hurt you," she said softly. Fiora leaned against her mother. "I know." Neither of them noticed Dion standing alone on the balcony. He looked toward the mountains without seeing them. In his mind, he kept replaying the same thought over and over. If Tyrese hadn't insisted on going to that meet, if he hadn't been on that bus, he closed his eyes and let out a long breath. The thought never left. It only became quieter. Nearly 3 months had passed since Tyrese's funeral. Every morning, Dion left for work before sunrise and came home long after dark. He barely spoke during dinner, and the apartment had grown so quiet that even the ticking clock on the kitchen wall seemed louder than before. One Saturday morning, Fiora woke up to the sound of someone knocking on her bedroom door. "Get dressed," Dion said. "We're going somewhere." 20 minutes later, his pickup truck pulled into the parking lot of Asheville High School. The track was empty except for a few runners warming up in the cool morning air. Fiora looked around in confusion. "Dad, why are we here?" Dion opened the back seat and pulled out a familiar duffel bag. He unzipped it and took out Tyrese's running shoes. For a few seconds, he simply stared at them before handing them to Fiora. "Put them on." Fiora looked down at the shoes. "These are Tyrese's." "I know." "Dad, put them on." Fiora slowly sat on the bench and slipped her feet into the oversized shoes. They were much too big. She could barely keep them on while standing. Dion walked onto the track and looked back at her. "Come here." Fiora hurried after him, struggling to keep the shoes from slipping off. Dion pointed toward the first curve of the track. "Run 1 lap," Fiora blinked. "Just run?" "Yes." She took a deep breath and started jogging. Before she had even reached the other side of the track, her breathing became uneven. Halfway through the lap, she slowed to a walk. By the time she returned to where Dion was standing, she was bent over, gasping for air. "I can't." Dion looked at her for a long moment. "Your brother never quit after 1 lap." Fiora lowered her head. "I'm not Tyrese." Dion looked away toward the empty lanes stretching ahead. "No." His voice was quiet. "You're not." After a few seconds, he pointed back toward the track. "Take a short break." Fiora looked up. "Then we'll do 1 more." From that day on, every morning began the same way. Before the sun came up, Dion knocked on Fiora's bedroom door. By 5:30, they were already at the track. At first, it was 1 lap, then 2. A week later, it became 3. Fiora never complained, but every afternoon she came home too tired to finish her homework before falling asleep at the kitchen table. One rainy morning, she slipped on the wet track and scraped both knees. Mary rushed toward her with a towel. "That's enough for today." Before Fiora could answer, Dion held out his hand and helped her back to her feet. "Walk it off." Mary stared at him. "She just fell." "She's fine." Mary knelt beside Fiora and gently cleaned the blood from her knee. "Does it hurt?" Fiora nodded without saying a word. That evening, Mary found a pair of bloody socks hidden at the bottom of Fiora's laundry basket. She walked into the living room holding them in one hand. Have you even looked at her feet? Dion looked up from the bills spread across the coffee table. She's building endurance. Mary dropped the socks onto the table. She's building blisters. Dion rubbed his forehead. If she quits every time something hurts, she'll spend her whole life believing she's weak. Mary looked at him in disbelief. She's 10 years old, Dion. Neither of them noticed Fiora standing quietly in the hallway. She looked down at her bandaged feet, then slowly walked back to her room. A few minutes later, Dion knocked on her door. "Set your alarm for 5. Fiora looked at him for a moment before quietly asking, "Can I wear my own shoes tomorrow?" Dion glanced at Tyrese's running shoes beside the bed. "No!" He picked them up and placed them in front of her. "You'll wear your brother's." By the beginning of summer, training had become part of Fiora's life. Every morning started at 5. Every afternoon ended with sore legs and aching feet. Dion kept adding a little more each week. Another lap, another hill, another minute. "You're getting stronger," he would say. Fiora wanted to believe him. She wanted to make him smile the way he used to smile at Tyrese. One Saturday morning, Dion drove her to a trail just outside Asheville where local runners trained before marathon season. The route climbed steadily through the hills before looping back toward the parking lot. "Today we're trying the hill," Dion said. Fiora looked up at the long incline. "Dad, I've never run uphill before. That's why we're here." She nodded and started running. The first few minutes weren't too bad. Then every step became harder than the last. Her breathing grew heavier. Her legs felt as if they were filled with sand. Halfway up the hill, she slowed to a walk. "Keep going," Dion called from behind. Fiora tried. She really did. She took a few more steps before stopping again. "Dad," she gasped. "I can't breathe." Dion pointed toward the top of the hill. Just a little farther, Fiora forced herself forward. One step, then another. Her vision blurred. The trees around her seemed to sway. She reached out as if to grab something, but there was nothing there. The next moment, her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the trail. "Fiora!" Dion ran toward her. She didn't answer. Her eyes were closed, and her face had turned pale. Dion dropped to his knees and gently shook her shoulder. "Fiora, wake up!" A couple who had been jogging nearby immediately ran over. "Call 911!" the man shouted to his wife. Dion picked Fiora up and held her in his arms. "Come on, sweetheart," he whispered, panic filling his voice. "Open your eyes." A few minutes later, the sound of sirens echoed through the mountains. Mary arrived at Mission Hospital less than 20 minutes after Dion called. She rushed into the emergency room and found Fiora lying quietly in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm. "Baby." Mary gently brushed the hair away from Fiora's forehead before turning toward Dion. "What happened?" Dion couldn't meet her eyes. She passed out during training. Mary stared at him. "Training?" Before Dion could answer, the doctor walked into the room holding Fiora's chart. "She's stable," he said. Fortunately, she was brought in quickly. Mary let out the breath she had been holding. "Will she be okay?" "She'll recover," but her body was pushed far beyond its limits. The doctor looked at Dion. "Your daughter was born with a condition that already affects her muscles. Forcing this level of physical training is extremely dangerous. If this continues, she could suffer permanent damage." The room fell silent. After the doctor left, Mary slowly turned back toward Dion. "How long?" Dion frowned. "What? How long have you been pushing her like this?" "I'm trying to make her stronger." "By sending her to the hospital?" Dion raised his voice for the first time in months. "You think I wanted this? Then why?" Mary asked. "Because I'm not going to lose another child!" The words echoed through the room. Mary looked at him for several seconds before speaking again. "You aren't helping Fiora." Her voice was calm now. "You're trying to replace Tyrese." Dion immediately shook his head. "That's not true." "Then tell me why she's wearing his shoes." Dion looked toward the pair of oversized running shoes sitting beside the hospital bed. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Mary wiped away the tears on her cheeks. "The son you lost is gone, Dion." She gently took Fiora's hand. "The daughter sitting in this bed is still here." Fiora had been awake for several minutes. She kept her eyes closed. She heard every single word. Fiora was discharged from the hospital the following afternoon. The ride home was quieter than the drive there. Mary sat beside her in the back seat while Dion kept both hands on the steering wheel. No one spoke. After they got home, Mary helped Fiora onto the couch and covered her with a blanket. Get some rest, she whispered. Fiora nodded and closed her eyes. A few minutes later, Mary walked into the bedroom she shared with Dion and quietly closed the door behind her. I'm taking Fiora and leaving. Dion looked up from the edge of the bed. You're overreacting. Am I? Mary asked. She collapsed because you kept pushing her. I was trying to help her. No, Mary shook her head. You were trying to turn her into someone she could never be. Dion stood up. I lost my son, Mary. So did I. Mary's voice cracked. But I refused to lose my daughter, too. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Mary walked to the closet and pulled out an old suitcase. She laid it on the bed and slowly began folding Fiora's clothes. Dion watched her in silence. You're really leaving? Mary zipped up the suitcase. I should have left the day you stopped seeing Fiora as your daughter. She walked out of the bedroom without looking back. Dion remained where he was, staring at the empty closet. The next morning, Mary loaded 2 suitcases into the trunk of an old taxi waiting outside the apartment. Everything they owned fit into those 2 cases. Fiora carried her backpack on one shoulder and held a small cardboard box against her chest. Inside were her sketchbook, a family photo, and the handwritten notes Mary had packed in her school lunches over the years. Before climbing into the taxi, she turned back toward the apartment one last time. Dion was standing just inside the front door. Mary looked at him. You don't have to do this. Dion let out a tired breath. Fine. His voice was flat. Do whatever you want. He looked at the 2 suitcases by the curb. Go wherever you want. After a long pause, he added, but don't come back. Mary lowered her head. She wanted to say something, but the words never came. Fiora slowly walked back toward her father. They stood only a few feet apart. Dad! Dion kept his eyes on the floor. Fiora tightened her grip on the cardboard box. One day, I'll make my dream come true. Dion didn't answer. I'll prove that I can do it. Still nothing. Fiora swallowed hard. I'll make you proud. Her voice trembled for the first time. Goodbye, Dad. She waited a few seconds, hoping he would look at her. He never did. Fiora turned around, climbed into the taxi, and quietly closed the door. As the taxi pulled away, she looked out the rear window until the apartment building disappeared behind the trees. Only then did Dion slowly step out onto the porch. The street was empty. He stood there for a long time before quietly walking back inside and closing the front door. The taxi stopped in front of a small apartment building on the east side of Asheville just before noon. Mary paid the driver, then stood quietly on the sidewalk for a moment. Everything they owned fit into 2 old suitcases, a backpack, and a small cardboard box. Fiora looked up at the 3-story brick building. The paint around the windows had faded, and the wooden stairs creaked with every step. Mary forced a smile. Come on, let's see our new home. The apartment was barely big enough for the 2 of them. There was a tiny kitchen, a worn-out couch, a small dining table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a bedroom just large enough for a bunk bed. The landlord handed Mary the keys. It's not fancy, he said, but the rent's affordable. Mary thanked him before closing the door behind them. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The apartment felt empty. Fiora slowly carried her cardboard box into the bedroom and placed it beside the bed. She looked around the unfamiliar room before quietly asking, Mom, do you think we'll be okay? Mary walked over, knelt in front of her, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I don't know if life will be easy, she smiled. But I do know one thing, Fiora looked at her. Mary held up the apartment key. Nobody here is going to tell you what you can or can't become. Fiora wrapped her arms around her mother. Mary hugged her back for a few seconds before standing up and clapping her hands together. All right, she looked around the apartment. Let's make this place feel like home. The rest of the afternoon was spent unpacking. Mary pushed the couch against the wall while Fiora folded clothes into the small dresser they had found at a thrift store that morning. By sunset, the apartment still looked simple, but it finally felt lived in. That night, the 2 of them sat on the living room floor eating instant noodles because they didn't own a dining table yet. Mary raised her plastic fork with a grin. Our first dinner in our new home. Fiora laughed and gently tapped her fork against her mother's. To new beginnings. Life settled into a routine faster than either of them expected. Every weekday, Mary left the apartment before sunrise to work as a nursing assistant. 3 evenings a week, she changed into a black polo shirt and worked the dinner shift at a family restaurant across town. Most nights, she didn't get home until after 10. While Mary worked, Fiora learned to take care of the little apartment. She swept the floors, washed the dishes, folded laundry, and started dinner before her mother came home. Sometimes dinner was scrambled eggs and toast. Sometimes it was rice with canned beans. On better weeks, Mary brought home leftover grilled chicken from the restaurant. One rainy evening, Fiora looked through the refrigerator before closing the door again. Mom. Mary looked up from a stack of unpaid bills. Yeah? We're almost out of milk. Mary picked up a pen and quietly added another number to the piece of paper in front of her. Rent, electricity, water, groceries, medication. She counted the cash in her wallet one more time before smiling at Fiora. Payday's Friday. Fiora nodded, even though she already knew the answer. After dinner, Mary carried 2 mugs of hot tea to the couch and opened her old laptop. Instead of watching television, she searched for videos about distance running. Proper running form, preventing running injuries, how to build endurance for beginners. Fiora looked over curiously. Mom, why are you watching all that? Mary smiled without taking her eyes off the screen. Because I promised someone she'd get another chance to chase her dream. You don't have to do this. Mary finally looked at her daughter. I know. She reached over and squeezed Fiora's hand. I want to. Around midnight, Fiora woke up to get a glass of water. As she walked past the living room, she noticed the laptop was still open. Mary had fallen asleep on the couch with a notebook resting on her lap. One page was filled with handwritten notes. Easy pace. Recovery days matter. Never ignore pain. Fiora quietly picked up the blanket from the arm of the couch and covered her mother. Before heading back to bed, she looked at the notebook one more time and smiled. The following Saturday, Mary woke Fiora just before sunrise. Get dressed, she whispered. I want to show you something. 20 minutes later, they were standing beside a quiet trail along the Blue Ridge Parkway. The mountains were still covered in morning mist, and only a handful of runners had arrived that early. Fiora looked around. Are we running? Mary smiled. Only if you want to? Fiora looked surprised. You're not going to tell me how many miles? Mary laughed. No, she handed Fiora a small sports watch she had bought at a thrift store for $5. Today's goal is simple. Fiora fastened it around her wrist. What's the goal? Mary pointed down the trail. Run until your body tells you to stop. Then we'll walk. Fiora stared at her mother for a second before smiling. That's it? That's it. Fiora started jogging at an easy pace while Mary walked beside the trail, holding a bottle of water and a small notebook. Every few minutes, Mary looked down and wrote something. When Fiora finally slowed to a walk, Mary didn't tell her to keep going. She simply handed her the water bottle. How do your legs feel? A little tired, Mary wrote something else. What about your breathing? Much better than before, Mary nodded. Good, that's progress. Fiora looked at the notebook. What are you writing? Mary turned it around. Every page was filled with little notes. Distance, time, weather, how Fiora felt after each run. Fiora smiled. You wrote all that? Mary laughed. I'm learning. From where? Mary pulled her phone out of her pocket. The screen was filled with bookmarked articles and videos about distance running. From coaches who know a lot more than I do. Fiora looked down at the notebook again. Mom, you're really becoming my coach, Mary smiled. I'm trying. Fiora wrapped her arms around her mother without saying another word. The years passed one season at a time. Every spring, the mountain trails filled with wildflowers. Every summer, mother and daughter left the apartment before sunrise to avoid the heat. Every fall, the leaves turned bright shades of red and gold beneath their feet. Every winter, they bundled themselves in old jackets and gloves before heading out into the cold. Little by little, Fiora grew stronger. The girl who once struggled to finish a single lap could now run 5 miles without stopping. Mary celebrated every milestone, no matter how small. The first time Fiora ran 3 miles, they shared a slice of apple pie from a diner on the way home. The first time she finished 5 miles, Mary bought 2 hot chocolates, even though they probably should have saved the money. We're celebrating, she said. 5 miles deserves hot chocolate. As Fiora improved, Mary improved too. She borrowed books from the public library about endurance training and sports nutrition. She spent nights watching coaching seminars online after finishing her second job. Sometimes she made mistakes. One week she increased Fiora's training too quickly, and Fiora complained that her calves hurt for days. Mary immediately adjusted the schedule and crossed out the rest of that week's workouts. "No running until you're completely pain-free," she said. Fiora frowned. "But I'll fall behind." Mary smiled and tapped the notebook. Rest is part of training. On weekends, they drove to local parks where community running clubs met. Most of the runners were adults, but they always welcomed Fiora with smiles and encouragement. An older marathon runner named Mr. Collins often jogged beside her during long runs. "Don't chase speed," he told her one morning. "Build your engine first. Speed comes later." Mary wrote that sentence down the moment she got home. By the time Fiora turned 15, the notebook Mary had started with only a few pages of scribbles had grown into 3 thick binders filled with training schedules, nutrition plans, race notes, and every lesson they had learned together. One evening, Fiora looked at the stack of binders on the bookshelf and laughed. "Mom, I think you know more than some real coaches now," Mary grinned. "Don't tell them that. They might start charging me tuition." By the time Fiora turned 15, running had become more than a dream. It had become part of who she was. Almost every Saturday, Mary drove her to local races across western North Carolina. Sometimes they left home before sunrise with peanut butter sandwiches wrapped in foil because buying breakfast on the road cost too much. They couldn't afford expensive race gear either. Fiora wore the same pair of running shoes for nearly a year. Every few weeks, Mary patched the worn-out soles with strong shoe glue to make them last a little longer. Their first race ended in disappointment. Fiora finished near the back of the pack and apologized all the way home. "I'm sorry, Mom. I know you spent money on the registration fee." Mary smiled as she kept her eyes on the road. "Did you quit?" Fiora shook her head. "No." "Then we got our money's worth." A month later, Fiora finished a little higher, then a little higher again. One race ended with a 5th-place ribbon, another with a bronze medal in her age group. They weren't big championships. Most people would never remember them, but Mary remembered every single one. Back at the apartment, she hammered a small corkboard onto the living room wall. Every ribbon, every medal, and every race bib found a place on it. Even the races where Fiora didn't win anything had their bibs carefully pinned beside the others. One evening, Fiora looked at the wall and laughed. "Mom, why did you keep this one?" "I finished 12th. Mary walked over and straightened the crooked race bib. "Because this was the first race where you smiled after crossing the finish line." Fiora pointed to another one. "And this?" Mary smiled again. "That was the race where you stopped looking behind you and started looking ahead." Fiora shook her head and laughed. "You remember everything." Mary looked at the wall for a long moment. "Every medal tells people how fast you ran." She gently tapped one of the race bibs. "These tell me how hard you fought to get there." Fiora wrapped an arm around her mother's shoulder. "One day, I'm going to fill this whole wall," Mary laughed. "Then I guess we'll need a bigger apartment." A few weeks later, Fiora noticed her mother rubbing the side of her chest while washing dishes after dinner. "Mom, are you okay?" Mary looked up and smiled. "Just pulled a muscle at work," Fiora frowned. "Maybe you should see a doctor." "Doctors are expensive." Mary picked up another plate and continued washing it. "I'll be fine." The same thing happened again a few days later, then again the following week. Sometimes Mary became short of breath after carrying groceries up the stairs. Other times she quietly sat down for a minute before pretending nothing had happened. Fiora noticed every time. Mary pretended not to. One Saturday morning, they drove to a local charity 10K. It wasn't a big race, but Mary had been looking forward to it for weeks. She stood near the finish line with her stopwatch and notebook, cheering louder than anyone else. "Let's go, Fiora! Beautiful pace! Keep your shoulders relaxed!" Fiora crossed the finish line with a new personal best. She spotted Mary smiling from the other side of the barrier and immediately ran over to hug her. "I did it!" Mary laughed and hugged her tightly. "I told you all those hill workouts would pay off." Before Fiora could answer, she felt her mother's arms suddenly loosen around her. Mary took one unsteady step backward. The smile disappeared from her face. "Mom?" Mary tried to answer, but no words came out. Her knees gave way beneath her. Fiora caught her before she hit the ground. "Mom!" People nearby rushed toward them. Someone called for an ambulance, while another runner knelt beside Mary to check her pulse. Fiora held her mother's hand so tightly that her own fingers began to shake. "Mom, please!" The sound of an ambulance echoed through the park as Mary lay unconscious in her daughter's arms. Fiora didn't leave Mary's side until the doctor walked into the hospital room the next morning. He placed several test results on the table before pulling up a chair. "Mrs. Jefferson, we've finished reviewing your scans," Mary nodded. "Tell me the truth." The doctor folded his hands together. "Your heart has been working much harder than it should for a long time. Based on what we found, you have severe dilated cardiomyopathy," Fiora frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means her heart has become too weak to pump blood efficiently." He looked at Mary. "The symptoms you've been ignoring over the past year weren't just exhaustion." Mary lowered her eyes. She already knew what he was about to say. "Can medication fix it?" she asked. The doctor slowly shook his head. "Medication can help manage the symptoms, but it won't solve the problem. You'll eventually need heart surgery." Fiora immediately asked the question Mary couldn't bring herself to ask. "How much will it cost?" The doctor opened another folder and slid a printed estimate across the table. Fiora stared at the numbers without saying a word. Even after insurance, the remaining cost was more money than they had ever saved. Mary quietly folded the paper and placed it back on the table. "We'll find a way," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The doctor handed Mary a small bottle of medication before standing up. "Until then, no heavy lifting, no physically demanding work. Get as much rest as possible." After he left, the room became silent. Fiora looked at her mother. "Mom." Mary reached over and held her hand. "I'm still here," Fiora nodded, but she couldn't stop looking at the folded estimate lying on the table between them. The apartment felt quieter than ever after Mary came home from the hospital. Her medications lined one side of the kitchen counter, and a sheet of doctor's instructions was taped to the refrigerator with a small magnet. Every morning, Fiora reminded her mother which pills to take before leaving for school. Every evening, she reminded her again. Mary tried to help around the apartment whenever Fiora wasn't looking. She folded laundry while sitting down. She washed a few dishes before needing to rest. Even walking from the bedroom to the kitchen sometimes left her short of breath. One afternoon, Fiora came home earlier than usual and found Mary standing in the kitchen, one hand gripping the counter while trying to pour herself a glass of water. Fiora rushed over and gently took the glass from her. "Mom, you should have called me," Mary smiled. "I was only getting some water." Fiora filled the glass and handed it back before helping her sit down. Neither of them said another word. That night, after Mary had fallen asleep, Fiora sat alone at the dining table with a calculator, a notebook, and a stack of unpaid bills. Rent, utilities, groceries, medication, follow-up appointments. She added every number twice, hoping she had made a mistake the first time. She hadn't. She opened the folded estimate from the hospital one more time, stared at it for nearly a minute, then quietly placed it back inside the envelope. The next afternoon, instead of going to the trail after school, Fiora walked into a small family restaurant a few blocks away. "Can I help you?" the manager asked. Fiora took a deep breath. "I was wondering if you're hiring." 2 days later, she started her first shift washing dishes and clearing tables after school. She didn't tell Mary. Every evening she came home wearing a smile, saying practice had gone well. Every evening Mary believed her. One night, Fiora quietly opened the drawer where she used to keep her running watch. She looked at it for a few seconds before placing it farther back inside the drawer. Then she closed it and got ready for another shift at the restaurant. The months slowly turned into years. Fiora never went back to the trails. Every weekday followed the same routine. School in the morning, work in the afternoon, home just before dinner. The restaurant manager gradually trusted her with more responsibilities. She learned how to greet customers, refill drinks, carry heavy trays, and close the dining room after the last table left. Every paycheck went into the same envelope inside the kitchen drawer. Across the front, Fiora had written 3 words with a black marker: Mom's Surgery Fund. Every Friday night, she quietly added another paycheck to the envelope before counting the total. It was growing, but never fast enough. Mary noticed the envelope every time Fiora opened the drawer. She never touched it. She never asked how much was inside. One evening, Fiora came home almost an hour later than usual. Her feet ached from standing all day, but she still smiled as she walked through the front door. "How was work?" Mary asked from the couch. "Busy," Fiora replied while setting a grocery bag on the kitchen counter. "The manager let me pick up an extra shift this weekend." Mary forced a smile. "That's good." Fiora unpacked the groceries one item at a time. Bread, eggs, milk, oatmeal, fresh fruit. The kind of food Mary used to insist athletes should eat. After dinner, Fiora helped her mother take her medication before walking into her bedroom. Around midnight, Mary woke up to get a glass of water. As she passed Fiora's room, she noticed light coming from beneath the door. It was slightly open. She stopped without making a sound. Fiora was sitting cross-legged on her bed with a half-empty bag of potato chips beside her. She wasn't scrolling through social media. She was watching the live broadcast of the Boston Marathon on her phone. Every time the camera followed the leaders climbing Heartbreak Hill, Fiora leaned closer to the screen. When one runner surged ahead near the finish, Fiora smiled without realizing it. "Come on," she whispered. "You can catch her." A few seconds later, the runner crossed the finish line. Fiora clapped softly so she wouldn't wake her mother. Then she replayed the final sprint again. And again. Mary remained standing outside the door. She looked at her daughter's face, lit only by the glow of the phone screen. It was the happiest she had seen Fiora in years. After a while, Fiora locked the phone, picked up the running watch from her nightstand, and held it in her hand for several seconds before placing it back exactly where it had been. She turned off the light and lay down to sleep. Mary quietly stepped away from the door before Fiora could notice her. Back in her own room, she sat on the edge of the bed with tears filling her eyes. For the first time, she understood the truth. Fiora hadn't stopped loving Marathon. She had only stopped allowing herself to chase it. Almost 3 years had passed since Mary left the hospital. The envelope labeled Mom's surgery fund had grown thicker, but every follow-up appointment seemed to make it thinner again. Some months, Fiora had to choose between adding money to the envelope or paying for Mary's medication. The envelope always lost. One Sunday afternoon, Fiora came home carrying 2 paper bags from the grocery store. She had just finished an extra shift covering for a coworker who had called in sick. As she stepped inside, she found Mary asleep on the couch with one of Fiora's old race bibs resting on her lap. Fiora smiled, gently picked up the bib, and slipped it back into the scrapbook before covering her mother with a blanket. A few hours later, Mary woke up and found dinner already waiting on the table. "You cooked again?" she asked. Fiora shrugged with a smile. "You're supposed to be resting, remember?" Mary looked around the apartment. The dishes were washed. The laundry had been folded. The trash had already been taken outside. There was nothing left for her to do. That evening, Fiora left for another shift at the restaurant. As soon as the front door closed, Mary slowly stood up and walked into Fiora's bedroom. She opened the closet to put away a clean sweater and noticed a shoebox tucked behind a stack of blankets. Curious, she pulled it out. Inside were dozens of pay stubs, neatly stacked in order. Beneath them was a small notebook. Mary opened it. Every page listed the same things: hours worked, tips earned, money saved, hospital bills paid, medication, remaining balance for surgery. On the last page, Fiora had written a single sentence: "No matter how long it takes, I'll get Mom her surgery." Mary's hands began to shake. She slowly closed the notebook and placed it back exactly where she had found it. That night, Fiora didn't get home until almost 11. She walked through the front door, kicked off her shoes, and smiled the moment she saw Mary still awake. "You should have gone to bed," Mary smiled back. "I wanted to wait for you." Fiora sat beside her on the couch. "Long day?" Mary asked. "A little. How's practice?" Fiora answered without hesitation. "Good." Mary looked at her daughter for a few seconds before nodding. "I'm glad." Fiora leaned back against the couch and closed her eyes. Less than a minute later, she had fallen asleep sitting upright, still wearing her work uniform. Mary quietly reached for the remote and turned off the television. Then she gently rested her hand on Fiora's head. She stayed there for a long time, watching her daughter sleep. By the next morning, Mary had already made a decision. She wasn't going to let Fiora throw away the rest of her life for her. The next Saturday, Fiora woke up to the smell of breakfast. She frowned and quickly got out of bed. "Mom?" she called as she hurried toward the kitchen. Mary was standing at the stove, flipping pancakes with a smile on her face. The dining table had already been set with 2 plates, fresh fruit, and orange juice. "Morning," Mary said cheerfully. Fiora's eyes widened. "Mom, what are you doing?" "Making breakfast. You shouldn't be standing this long, Mary laughed. I've been sitting around this apartment for almost 3 years. I think I can survive making pancakes. After breakfast, Fiora carried the dishes to the sink, but when she came back, the kitchen had already been cleaned. Mom! Mary looked up from folding a towel. What? You don't have to do all this, Mary shrugged. I wanted to. The rest of the morning felt strangely normal. Mary watered the plants outside the apartment, folded laundry, and even swept the living room while humming softly to herself. Fiora followed her around the apartment all day. Mom, let me do that. Mom, sit down. Mom, Mary laughed every time. I'm fine, sweetheart. That afternoon, the two of them sat on the small porch outside their apartment with 2 glasses of iced tea. Neither of them spoke for a while. They simply watched children riding bicycles across the parking lot. Finally, Mary broke the silence. I've been watching you, Fiora looked at her. Watching me? Mary nodded. Every morning before work. Every night after work. Every time you smiled so I wouldn't worry. Fiora lowered her eyes. Mary reached over and gently took her hand. Then one night, she smiled sadly. I saw you watching the Boston Marathon, Fiora froze. Mary squeezed her hand a little tighter. I've also seen the envelope. Fiora's lips parted, but no words came out, and the notebook, tears slowly filled Fiora's eyes. Mom, Mary shook her head. You gave up the thing you love most because you wanted to save me. Fiora finally looked up. Because I don't want to lose you. Mary's eyes turned red. She brushed a tear from Fiora's cheek with her thumb. Listen to me, Fiora nodded. These past few years, Mary whispered, you've been living my life. She gently placed Fiora's running watch in her daughter's hand. I want you to start living yours again. Fiora closed her fingers around the watch. But your surgery, Mary smiled. We'll figure that out together. Fiora shook her head. I can't leave you alone, Mary laughed softly. Sweetheart, she pointed toward the trail that could be seen in the distance beyond the apartment buildings. You belong out there. Fiora couldn't hold back her tears anymore. She leaned forward and hugged her mother as tightly as she could. Mary closed her eyes and held her daughter close. Promise me something, Fiora nodded against her shoulder. Run again. Not for me. For yourself. The first morning back felt strangely unfamiliar. Before sunrise, Fiora quietly tied her running shoes while the apartment remained silent. She packed Mary's morning medication into a small pill organizer, placed a bottle of water beside the couch, and left a handwritten note on the coffee table. Breakfast is in the oven. Don't forget your medicine. I'll be home after work. Love you. Before opening the front door, she looked back one more time. Mary smiled from the couch and waved her hand. Go on. I'll be fine. Fiora hesitated for a second before finally leaving. The moment the apartment door closed, Mary's smile slowly faded. She rested one hand against her chest and waited until her breathing became steady again before reaching for the glass of water. By the time Fiora finished her morning run, she had just enough time to shower and head to work. Nearly every evening followed the same routine. She clocked out just before 6, grabbed a sandwich on the way to the park, changed into her running clothes in the public restroom, and trained until the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Some nights her legs still felt heavy after standing all afternoon at the restaurant. Some nights she wanted nothing more than to go home and sleep. But every time she thought about quitting early, she remembered the way Mary had placed the red bracelet around her wrist, so she kept running. When she finally returned home each night, Mary always greeted her with the same bright smile. How was training? Better than yesterday, Fiora would answer almost every time. Mary smiled proudly. Tomorrow will be even better. Later that night, after Fiora had gone to bed, Mary quietly walked into the bathroom, locked the door, and leaned both hands against the sink. Her face had turned pale. She reached into the medicine cabinet, swallowed another pill with shaking hands, then splashed cold water across her face before forcing herself to smile again. By morning, it looked as though nothing had happened. The park became part of Fiora's life again. Every evening, just before sunset, runners filled the paved trail that wound through the trees. Some came to stay in shape. Others trained for upcoming races. Fiora came because it was the only place where she felt completely free. For nearly 2 weeks, she never noticed the tall man with silver hair who arrived around the same time every evening. He always stretched near the same bench before beginning his own run. One evening, as Fiora settled into her pace, the man jogged past her with smooth, effortless strides. He glanced at his watch, then continued down the trail. 20 minutes later, he was running back in the opposite direction. Most runners had already finished and started heading home. Fiora was still running. The next evening, the same thing happened. Then again the day after that. By the end of the week, the man had stopped checking his watch. Instead, he found himself watching the young woman who refused to stop. She wasn't the fastest runner in the park. In fact, many people passed her during the first few miles, but almost all of them were gone long before she finished. She never looked at anyone else. She never complained. She simply kept moving forward with the same steady rhythm from beginning to end. One evening, curiosity finally got the better of him. As Fiora stopped beside a drinking fountain to refill her bottle, he walked over and nodded politely. "Long run?" Fiora smiled. "Trying to make it one." He noticed the restaurant logo printed across her work shirt, which she had tied around her waist after changing into running clothes. "Straight from work?" Fiora nodded. "It's the only time I have," the man smiled. That explains a lot. Before Fiora could ask what he meant, he politely tipped his cap. "Have a good run." Then he jogged away without saying another word. Fiora watched him disappear down the trail before shrugging and continuing her workout. She had no idea that the man had just become genuinely interested in her future. Over the next several weeks, Trayvon kept seeing Fiora at the park. Rain or shine, she always arrived after work, wearing the same faded backpack. Some evenings she looked exhausted before she even started running. Even then, she never skipped a workout. One night, Trayvon deliberately changed his own route so he could observe her longer. He noticed something most people would have missed. Fiora wasn't naturally powerful. She didn't have the long stride or explosive speed of the stronger runners. But once she settled into her pace, it barely changed. Mile after mile, her breathing stayed controlled, her cadence stayed steady, and she almost never stopped to rest. Trayvon smiled to himself. Interesting. That evening, after arriving home, he found Jackson setting the dinner table. "You look like you've been thinking about something all day," Jackson said. Trayvon poured himself a glass of water before sitting down. "I met someone," Jackson raised an eyebrow. "A business partner?" Trayvon chuckled. "A runner," Jackson laughed. "Another elite athlete?" Trayvon shook his head. "Not yet." He pulled out his phone and showed Jackson a photo he had quietly taken from a distance while several runners were stretching after training. Fiora stood near the back of the group, tying her shoelaces. "She doesn't look like much," Jackson admitted. "Exactly," Trayvon smiled. "That's what everyone would say." Jackson looked at the picture again. "So what makes her different?" Trayvon leaned back in his chair. "I've watched her for over a month. She trains after working all afternoon. She never rushes. She never shows off. She just keeps going." Jackson handed the phone back. "You think she has potential?" Trayvon nodded without hesitation. "I think she's the kind of athlete you can't measure by looking at her." The following evening, father and son arrived at the park together. Fiora had just finished cooling down when Trayvon walked over with Jackson beside him. "Good evening," Trayvon said with a friendly smile. Fiora recognized him immediately. "Hi." Trayvon reached into his jacket pocket and handed her a business card. "My name is Trayvon Smith." Fiora glanced at the card before looking back up. "Nice to meet you," Trayvon continued. "I've been watching your training for a while." Fiora looked slightly embarrassed. "Hopefully I wasn't doing anything wrong," Trayvon laughed. "Quite the opposite." He pointed toward the trail. "You have something most runners can't be taught." Fiora waited for him to continue. "Discipline," Jackson finally spoke. "My father sponsors several endurance athletes. He thinks you'd be worth investing in." Fiora looked down at the card again before carefully handing it back. "I'm honored," she smiled politely. "But I can't accept." Jackson looked surprised. "Why not?" Fiora adjusted the strap of her backpack. "Running isn't the most important thing in my life right now. My mother needs me. I still have responsibilities at home." Trayvon didn't try to change her mind. Instead, he gently pushed the card back toward her. "Keep it anyway." Fiora hesitated before accepting it. Trayvon smiled. "One day, if you decide you're ready, give me a call." He nodded politely before walking away with Jackson. Fiora slipped the card into the front pocket of her backpack. She never imagined she would need it sooner than she thought. Nearly a year passed after Fiora returned to training. She wasn't the same runner she had once been, but she was getting stronger every month. Her pace improved. Her endurance returned. The local running club began recognizing her name whenever she showed up for weekend workouts. One evening, after finishing a 10-mile training run, Fiora sat on a park bench scrolling through upcoming races on her phone. A regional 20-kilometer road race caught her attention. She smiled as she read the details until her eyes stopped on one sentence near the bottom of the page. Professional division entries require an approved sponsor and registered medical support team. The smile slowly disappeared from her face. "There has to be another way," she whispered. Over the next several days, she searched every race she could find within driving distance. Different cities, different organizers, different websites. The answer was always the same. Elite and development divisions required official sponsorship and medical supervision. Late one night, after Mary had gone to bed, Fiora sat alone at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She rubbed her eyes before closing another registration page. Rejected. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. Almost a year of training, and she couldn't even stand on the starting line. Her eyes drifted toward the small corkboard hanging beside the refrigerator. Tucked beneath a grocery list was a business card she had nearly forgotten about, Trayvon Smith. She quietly walked over and took it down. For several minutes, she simply turned it over in her hands. Pride had kept her from making this call. She had wanted to prove she could reach the starting line by herself. But this wasn't about pride anymore. It was about opportunity. Fiora picked up her phone, entered the number, then stopped before pressing the call button. She took a long breath, looked toward Mary's bedroom, and finally tapped the screen. The phone rang twice. "This is Trayvon Smith," Fiora swallowed. "Master Smith!" There was a brief pause before Trayvon recognized the voice. "Fiora?" "Yes, sir. I was wondering if your offer still stands." A smile slowly spread across Trayvon's face. He leaned back in his chair and looked out the office window. "I was beginning to think you'd never call," Fiora let out a nervous laugh. "I wanted to do this on my own." "I know," Trayvon replied. "That's exactly why I never called you first." Fiora lowered her head. "I think I'm finally ready." Trayvon nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Good. Let's help you get to the starting line." 3 months after signing the sponsorship agreement, Jackson called Fiora just as she was finishing her shift at the restaurant. "I've got something for you," he said. "A 20-kilometer elite development race in Roanoke, Virginia. It's about 200 miles north of Asheville. The race is designed for first-year professional runners, and a lot of sports media will be covering it." Fiora stopped walking. "When is it?" "Next Friday." She quickly did the math in her head. The drive alone would take several hours. Between traveling, registration, and race day, she would be away from home for at least 3 days. Her smile slowly faded. "I don't think I can." Jackson sounded surprised. "Why not?" Fiora looked toward the apartment building across the street. "My mom can't stay by herself that long." Jackson was quiet for a moment before saying, "Talk to her first. Then let me know." That evening, Fiora sat beside Mary on the couch and told her everything. Mary listened without interrupting. When Fiora finished, she simply smiled. "You're going." Fiora immediately shook her head. "Mom?" "No." Mary reached over and squeezed her hand. "You've worked too hard to miss this. But you'll be here by yourself." "I'll be fine," Fiora laughed softly. "You always say that," Mary smiled back. "Because it's true." Fiora looked at her mother for several long seconds before quietly saying, "If something happens while I'm gone," Mary gently placed a finger against Fiora's lips. "Nothing is going to happen." She slowly stood up and walked into her bedroom. A few moments later, she returned holding a small red bracelet made from braided thread. Tiny knots had been carefully tied by hand all the way around it. "I've been making this for weeks," Mary said. Fiora looked at it in surprise. "For me?" Mary nodded. "Give me your hand." Fiora held out her wrist. Mary carefully tied the bracelet into place before gently patting it once. "There," Fiora smiled. "It's beautiful." Mary looked into her daughter's eyes. "Bring your best home," Fiora nodded. "I will." Early the next morning, Jackson pulled into the apartment parking lot. He loaded Fiora's bag into the trunk while Trayvon checked that all the race documents were in order. Before getting into the car, Fiora hugged Mary tightly. "I'll call every night." Mary kissed her forehead. "I'll be waiting." Fiora smiled one last time before climbing into the car. She looked back through the window as they pulled away. Mary was still standing outside, waving until the car disappeared around the corner. Only after it was gone did Mary slowly lower her hand. She waited another few seconds, then quietly held one hand against her chest and leaned against the porch railing until the dizziness passed. After catching her breath, she straightened herself, smiled to no one in particular, and slowly walked back inside. Roanoke welcomed runners from across the southeast. Banners stretched across downtown streets, television crews moved between interview tents, and volunteers hurried from one checkpoint to another. It was unlike anything Fiora had ever experienced. She stood near the starting line wearing her race bib while quietly taking everything in. Jackson walked over holding 2 paper cups. Water? Fiora accepted one with a grateful smile. Nervous? She nodded. A little. Jackson looked toward the crowd gathering behind the barricades. Good. It means today matters. A race official stepped onto the stage and began introducing several of the top young runners expected to compete. One name drew louder applause than the others. Hazel Williams! Fiora looked toward the front row of athletes. Hazel was tall, athletic, and moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years competing at the highest junior level. Her warm-up jacket displayed the logo of a nationally recognized running academy. Trayvon noticed Fiora watching. She's been training with professional coaches since she was a kid, he said quietly. Fiora smiled. Then I'll get to learn from the best. The starting horn echoed through the streets. Hundreds of runners surged forward. Fiora resisted the temptation to match the leaders. She stayed relaxed, remembering every lesson Mary had written in her notebook. Don't race the first mile. Race the last one. 5 kilometers passed, then 10. One by one, runners who had started too fast began fading. Fiora slowly moved through the field without changing her rhythm. By the 15-kilometer mark, only 3 women remained ahead of her. Trayvon watched the live timing on his tablet and smiled. She's running exactly the race she planned. Jackson looked up. She's catching them. The final 2 kilometers became a battle between Fiora and Hazel. Hazel still had another gear. She accelerated through the final stretch with powerful strides that Fiora couldn't quite match. Fiora pushed as hard as she could, refusing to give away a single step. The finish line came into view. Hazel crossed first. Less than 20 seconds later, Fiora crossed in second place. Exhausted, Fiora bent over with both hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath. She felt someone lightly tap her shoulder. It was Hazel. She held out her hand with a smile. That was one heck of a race. Fiora smiled and shook it. Congratulations, Hazel laughed. I was looking over my shoulder the last 5 kilometers wondering who refused to disappear. Fiora laughed for the first time all day. I almost caught you. Almost. Hazel grinned. Which means I'll have to train harder before we meet again. Before walking toward the podium, Hazel pulled out her phone. Give me your number, Fiora looked surprised. Why? Because I'd rather race against friends than strangers. Fiora smiled and handed over her phone. A few moments later, the 2 women stood side by side on the podium. Hazel lifted the gold medal above her head while Fiora looked down at the silver medal resting in her hands. She smiled softly. It wasn't first place, but it was the first medal she had ever earned on a professional starting line. As photographers snapped pictures, Fiora quietly touched the red bracelet around her wrist. We did it, Mom, she whispered. This one's for you. The silver medal rested on the passenger seat the entire drive back to Asheville. Every few miles, Fiora glanced at it and smiled. She had already decided where she wanted to hang it, right beside the corkboard Mary had started years ago. Before leaving Roanoke that morning, she stopped at a small bakery and bought Mary's favorite pecan pie. At a flower stand near the highway, she picked out a bouquet of white lilies. She's going to love this, she said quietly as she climbed back into the car. Jackson smiled from the driver's seat. She'll probably cry, Fiora laughed. She always does. By the time they reached Asheville, the sun was already beginning to set. Jackson carried Fiora's duffel bag to the apartment entrance. Call me tomorrow, he said. Your next race won't be too far away, Fiora nodded. Thank you for everything. She picked up the flowers with one hand, the pie with the other, and hurried upstairs. Mom, she called as she unlocked the door. I'm home! The apartment was silent. She stepped inside and looked around. The lights were off. Mary's favorite blanket was still folded neatly on the couch. Mom? No answer. Fiora checked the bedroom. Empty. The bathroom. Empty. The kitchen. Empty. She frowned and hurried back outside. Missers. Henderson from the apartment across the hall was carrying groceries up the stairs. Missers! Henderson! The older woman turned around, her smile disappearing the moment she saw Fiora. Oh, sweetheart. Fiora's stomach tightened. Have you seen my mom, Missers? Henderson slowly set her grocery bags down. You don't know? Fiora felt her heart begin to race. Know what, Missers? Henderson gently placed a hand on Fiora's arm. Yesterday morning, your mother collapsed outside the grocery store. Fiora stared at her. What? The ambulance came right away. They took her to Mission Hospital. The flowers slipped from Fiora's hand and landed on the concrete steps. Without another word, she turned and ran. She didn't remember crossing the parking lot. She didn't remember getting into Jackson's car. She only remembered repeating the same words over and over. Please be okay. Please be okay. 20 minutes later, she burst through the hospital entrance and ran to the reception desk. Mary Jefferson, she gasped. Where's my mom? The nurse looked at the computer, then slowly stood up. One moment. A doctor walked over a few seconds later. His face told Fiora everything before he spoke. Are you Ms. Fiora Jefferson? She nodded. I'm very sorry. The words that followed became a blur. Fiora stood perfectly still. The silver medal hanging around her neck suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. No, she whispered. There must be a mistake. The doctor gently shook his head. Your mother suffered cardiac arrest on the way here. Fiora's knees gave way beneath her. Jackson caught her before she hit the floor. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the doctor's sleeve. But she was getting better. She was cooking again. She was smiling. She told me she was okay. The doctor looked at her with quiet sympathy. She wasn't getting better. Fiora stared at him through blurred eyes. What? Her condition had continued to worsen. He paused before speaking again. Based on the examination, she'd been pushing herself far beyond what her heart could safely handle. Fiora slowly shook her head. No. She said she felt stronger. The doctor looked down for a moment. Sometimes the people we love hide how much they're suffering because they're afraid of holding us back. Fiora covered her mouth as memories flooded back all at once. Mary making breakfast. Mary sweeping the apartment. Mary telling her to go race. Mary tying the red bracelet around her wrist. None of it had been because she was healthy. She had been saying goodbye. Fiora looked down at the bracelet still wrapped around her wrist. She finally understood why Mary's hands had been trembling that morning. A cry escaped her chest before she collapsed into Jackson's arms. The bouquet of white lilies slipped from her fingers and scattered across the hospital floor beside the silver medal she had been so eager to show her mother. The apartment felt empty in a way Fiora had never experienced before. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was unbearable. Every morning, the alarm still rang at 5:30, but there was no reason to get out of bed. The running shoes remained by the front door exactly where she had left them after returning from Roanoke. Days passed without anyone touching them. Trayvon called several times. Fiora never answered. Jackson left voicemail after voicemail. None were returned. Hazel sent short messages every few days. Thinking about you. I'm here if you need anything. No pressure. Just letting you know you're not alone. Fiora read every message. She replied to none of them. A week after the funeral, the restaurant manager called to ask if she planned to return to work. Fiora quietly apologized and said she wasn't ready. The manager understood. He told her to take whatever time she needed. One afternoon, Jackson stopped by the apartment carrying 2 grocery bags. He knocked several times before placing them beside the front door. I'm leaving these here, he said through the door. There's fresh fruit, bread, and your favorite soup. You don't have to talk to me. He waited another minute. The apartment remained silent. Jackson looked at the closed door, sighed softly, then walked away. A few days later, Hazel came by after training. She didn't knock. She simply placed a small paper bag beside the groceries Jackson had brought earlier. Inside was an energy bar, a bottle of water, and a handwritten note. The trails are still here whenever you're ready. Fiora opened the door only after hearing Hazel's car drive away. She picked up the bag, unfolded the note, read it once, then quietly placed it on the kitchen table beside Mary's notebook. The apartment looked exactly the same as it had the day Mary left for the hospital. Her reading glasses still rested beside the couch. The red coffee mug she used every morning remained in the kitchen cabinet. Even the blanket she liked to wrap around herself while watching television was still folded neatly over the armrest. Fiora couldn't bring herself to move any of it. Every night before going to bed, she walked into Mary's bedroom, sat quietly on the edge of the bed, and stared out the window until the room became too dark to see. She kept telling herself that if she stayed there long enough, she might hear her mother's voice one more time. But the only thing that answered was silence. Nearly a month passed before Fiora stepped outside for anything other than groceries. She no longer answered phone calls. She no longer checked race schedules. The running watch Mary had given her remained inside the top drawer of her nightstand. Dust slowly settled across her running shoes by the front door. Every afternoon around the same time, someone knocked. Sometimes it was Jackson. Sometimes it was Hazel. Sometimes it was Trayvon. None of them expected the door to open anymore. They simply left something behind before quietly walking away. One evening, Fiora opened the door after hearing footsteps disappear down the hallway. A small insulated bag sat on the floor. Inside was a container of homemade chicken noodle soup and a folded note. "Eat something warm." Jackson Fiora carried it inside but didn't touch it until later that night. 2 days later, another knock came. This time it was a small paper bag. Inside was a pair of brand new running socks and a handwritten note from Hazel. "I'm not asking you to run. Just don't throw your shoes away." Fiora couldn't help smiling for the first time in weeks. It disappeared almost as quickly as it came. One Saturday morning, Trayvon stopped by carrying a cardboard box. He placed it beside the door and knocked once before turning around. Just as he reached the stairs, the apartment door opened a few inches. Fiora stood there wearing oversized sweatpants and one of Mary's old sweaters. She looked thinner than the last time he had seen her. "Master Smith." Trayvon turned around but stayed where he was. "Good morning." Fiora looked down at the box. "What's this?" "Just a few groceries." She immediately shook her head. "I can't accept money." Trayvon smiled gently. "Good." Fiora looked confused. "Because there isn't any." She slowly opened the box. Pasta, rice, canned vegetables, oatmeal, coffee, everything Mary used to buy every month. Trayvon spoke quietly. "An athlete still has to eat." Fiora lowered her head. "I'm not an athlete anymore." Trayvon didn't answer right away. He simply looked at the pair of dusty running shoes beside the front door. Those shoes seemed to disagree. Fiora followed his eyes before quietly closing the box again. "I'm sorry." Trayvon smiled kindly. "You don't have to apologize for grieving." He took one step backward toward the stairs. "We'll stop knocking when you're ready for us to stop." Fiora looked at him without speaking. Trayvon nodded once before walking away. She remained standing in the doorway until he disappeared from sight. Then she slowly carried the box inside. As she unpacked the groceries, a folded envelope slipped from the bottom of the box. There was no money inside, only a single sheet of paper. On it was one sentence. "The finish line isn't going anywhere. We'll wait for you." Fiora read the sentence over and over before quietly placing it inside Mary's notebook. That night, sleep never came. Fiora sat alone in the living room with only a small lamp glowing beside the couch. The apartment felt colder than usual. Her eyes wandered across the room until they stopped on the notebook Mary had carried everywhere for years. It was still lying exactly where she had left it before driving to Roanoke. Fiora stared at it for a long time before finally reaching over and opening the first page. The familiar handwriting immediately caught her attention. Week 1. Don't worry about speed. Teach her to love running first. Speed can wait. Fiora smiled through her tears. She slowly turned another page. Every workout had been carefully recorded. Distance, pace, weather, what Fiora had eaten, how she felt after every run. Mary hadn't missed a single day. Another page. Fiora looked disappointed today because she couldn't finish the last hill. I reminded her that mountains don't move. We do. One step at a time. Fiora let out a shaky laugh. I remember that. She kept reading. Hundreds of pages, hundreds of little memories she had forgotten. Then she reached the final section. The handwriting looked weaker, less steady. She frowned and continued. I had to stop halfway while making breakfast this morning. I hope Fiora didn't notice. Fiora's breathing slowed. She turned another page. She smiled after training today. That's all I wanted. Another page. The pain is getting worse, but she's running again. I'd go through it all a second time if it meant seeing that smile. Fiora covered her mouth as tears rolled down her face. She kept reading. If you're reading this one day, it probably means I'm no longer beside you. So let me be your coach one last time. When life hurts, don't stop. Slow down if you need to. Rest if you have to. Cry as long as you want. But when you're ready, put your shoes back on. Fiora could barely see the page anymore. A tear landed across the final paragraph, blurring the ink. She gently wiped it away with her sleeve before reading the last sentence Mary had ever written. Promise me, your finish line will never become my grave. Keep running, sweetheart. Live the life we dreamed about together. Fiora slowly closed the notebook and held it against her chest. For the first time since Mary's funeral, she cried without trying to stop herself. The tears came harder than ever before, carrying away weeks of silence, guilt, and anger. When the crying finally stopped, dawn was beginning to brighten the window. Fiora looked toward the front door where her running shoes still waited beneath a thin layer of dust. She didn't touch them. Not yet. But for the first time in a long while, she stood up and walked toward them. The next morning, the apartment was quieter than it had been in weeks. Fiora stood in front of the shoe rack for a long time before reaching down and picking up her running shoes. A thin layer of dust covered the toes. She brushed it away with the palm of her hand, then slowly tied the laces. When she stepped outside, the cool morning air filled her lungs. For a moment, she almost turned back. Then she remembered the last page of Mary's notebook. Slow down if you need to. Rest if you have to. But when you're ready, put your shoes back on. Fiora took her first step, then another. She wasn't trying to train. She wasn't trying to set a personal best. She simply wanted to run again. The familiar trail looked exactly the same as it always had. The trees hadn't changed. The birds still sang from the branches. The gravel still crunched beneath her shoes. Only one thing was missing. No one was waiting at the finish with a stopwatch and a smile anymore. After less than half a mile, Fiora slowed to a walk. She bent over, resting both hands on her knees. Tears blurred her vision. Every corner of the trail reminded her of Mary. The bench where they used to drink water together. The hill where Mary celebrated her first 5-mile run with 2 cups of hot chocolate. The curve where Mary had once laughed because Fiora insisted she could outrun a squirrel. Fiora covered her face and cried. "I miss you, Mom," she whispered. A pair of footsteps approached from behind. Hazel slowed to a stop a few feet away. She had clearly been out training, but she didn't say a word about running. She simply held out a bottle of water. Fiora looked up in surprise. Hazel smiled gently. "I figured I'd find you here someday." Fiora accepted the bottle with trembling hands. "I'm sorry," Hazel frowned. "For what? For disappearing?" Hazel shrugged. "You lost your mom." She sat down on the edge of the trail beside Fiora. "You didn't owe anyone an explanation." The two of them sat there in silence for several minutes. Finally, Hazel stood up and stretched. "I'm going to finish my run." She looked down at Fiora with a small smile. "Come with me if you want," Fiora hesitated. Hazel didn't wait for an answer. She simply started jogging at an easy pace. After watching her for a few seconds, Fiora stood up. She took a deep breath and began jogging behind her. Neither of them spoke another word. They simply ran together beneath the morning sun, one steady step at a time. The weeks slowly turned into months. Fiora returned to work at the restaurant during the day and trained every evening until the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Hazel became a familiar face on nearly every trail and at almost every local race. What had started as a rivalry gradually became a friendship built on mutual respect. Neither of them ever went easy on the other once the starting horn sounded. At one race in Charlotte, Hazel crossed the finish line first while Fiora claimed second. A month later in Knoxville, Fiora won by less than 10 seconds, and Hazel laughed as soon as she caught her breath. "I'm never letting that happen again," Fiora grinned. "You'd better train harder then." A few weeks later, they both finished behind another veteran runner and stood on the podium together with bronze and silver medals hanging around their necks. "Guess we both got humbled today," Hazel joked as they posed for pictures. "We needed it," Fiora replied with a laugh. Race after race, their names began appearing together on local leaderboards. Sometimes Hazel stood on the highest step of the podium. Sometimes Fiora did. Sometimes neither of them won at all. But every finish line taught them something new. Trayvon quietly watched Fiora's progress from the sidelines, saying very little unless she asked for advice. Jackson handled race registrations, travel schedules, and sponsorship paperwork, making sure Fiora could focus entirely on training. Little by little, running stopped feeling like an escape from grief. It became part of Fiora's life again. After one race, Hazel tossed 2 cheeseburgers onto the picnic table outside a small roadside diner. "We earned these," Fiora laughed. "You say that after every race," Hazel unwrapped her burger. "Because it's true after every race." They spent the next hour teasing each other about missed turns, terrible pacing decisions, and near falls on muddy trails. For the first time in a very long while, Fiora laughed so hard that tears filled her eyes. They weren't tears of sadness anymore. As autumn faded into winter and winter gave way to spring, one season quietly replaced another. Without realizing it, nearly a full year had passed since Mary left the world. 1 year after Mary's passing, Fiora drove to the same flower shop she had visited so many times before. She carefully picked out a bouquet of white lilies, then stopped at a small family restaurant a few blocks away. The owner smiled the moment he saw her. "The usual?" Fiora nodded with a gentle smile. "The usual." A few minutes later, she walked back to her car, carrying a warm paper bag filled with the fried chicken they used to share after long training days. The smell instantly brought back memories of the tiny apartment, 2 paper plates on the coffee table, and Mary's voice reminding her not to eat too fast because the food wasn't going anywhere. By late morning, Fiora arrived at the cemetery. As she walked toward Mary's grave, she suddenly noticed something that made her slow down. A fresh bouquet of flowers had already been placed neatly in front of the headstone. She stopped for a moment and looked around. The cemetery was quiet. No one was nearby. Fiora smiled to herself. "Looks like someone still remembers you, Mom." She gently placed her own flowers beside the first bouquet before sitting down on the grass. She opened the paper bag and smiled. "I know," she laughed softly. "You'd probably tell me fried chicken isn't the best recovery meal." She took a small bite before looking at the headstone again. "Hazel's still impossible to beat when she decides to sprint," she laughed. "But don't worry, I've beaten her a few times too." She reached into her backpack and carefully laid several medals on the grass in front of the headstone. Gold, silver, bronze. One by one, she lined them up. "These all belong here first." Her fingers rested on the silver medal from Roanoke a little longer than the others. "I finally understand why you wanted me to go." She smiled through eyes that had quietly begun to fill with tears. "Thank you for pretending everything was okay." A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Fiora sat there for almost an hour, talking about races, work, Trayvon, Jackson, Hazel, and all the little things she wished she could still tell her mother. It felt less like visiting a grave and more like spending the afternoon together again. Eventually, she gathered the medals, stood up, and lightly brushed the grass from her jeans. She placed one hand on the headstone and smiled. "I'll see you again soon, Mom." Then she turned and slowly walked toward the cemetery gate. She never looked back. Long after Fiora disappeared from sight, a tall man with silver hair stepped out from behind a row of old oak trees. He remained standing where he was, his eyes fixed on the path Fiora had just taken. He stayed there for a long time without saying a single word. Then, with one final glance toward Mary's grave, he quietly turned around and walked away. 2 years passed faster than Fiora ever imagined. What began as small weekend races gradually became regional championships. Some weekends she stood on the top step of the podium. Other weekends Hazel did. Reporters slowly grew used to seeing their names side by side on the results board. Their rivalry pushed them both to become stronger with every race. Early one spring morning, Jackson walked into the training track holding a folded brochure. "I think you'll want to see this." Fiora accepted it and immediately recognized the logo printed across the front. Her breathing almost stopped. The Blue Ridge Endurance Marathon. The race was held only once every 10 years and was considered the most prestigious endurance event in the region. Thousands of runners had dreamed of standing on its starting line. This year's edition had broken every previous registration record before entries had even closed. Television networks would broadcast the race live across several states, and scouts from professional teams were expected to attend. Jackson smiled. "Registration opens tomorrow." Fiora kept staring at the brochure. Her fingers slowly traced the race logo as memories quietly returned. Years ago, Tyrese had sat beside her on the front porch with a magazine open across his knees. He had pointed to the same logo with excitement shining in his eyes. "One day," he had said, "I'm going to run this race." Fiora had laughed. "You'll probably win it," Tyrese grinned. "Then you'll have to race me." The memory faded into another, a small apartment. Rain tapping against the windows. Mary knitting the little red bracelet while Fiora stretched after training. Mary had smiled without looking up. "If you ever run that race someday," she chuckled softly, "you'd better bring home a medal and make your mama proud." Fiora had laughed. "That's a lot of pressure," Mary winked. "I'm kidding." Then, after a brief pause, she added more quietly, "Just finishing would already make me proud." Fiora lowered the brochure and looked toward the mountains rising beyond the stadium. Her thumb gently brushed across the faded red bracelet still wrapped around her wrist. It had been repaired twice over the years, but she had never taken it off. Hazel walked over, carrying 2 bottles of water. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Fiora smiled and handed her the brochure. Hazel's eyes widened. "No way," she looked back at Fiora. "You're signing up, right?" Fiora nodded without hesitation. "There's no way I'd miss it." Hazel laughed. "Good." She held out her hand. "Then let's find out who's standing on the podium this time." Fiora shook her hand with a smile. "I'll see you at the starting line." Race morning arrived long before sunrise. Even at 4:30, the streets surrounding downtown Asheville were already packed with runners carrying backpacks, stretching beside the barricades, and checking their watches one last time. Volunteers hurried between hydration stations while television crews adjusted cameras along the starting straight. The excitement felt different from every race Fiora had entered before. This wasn't just another marathon. It was the race people talked about for years. Fiora stood quietly near the warm-up area, smoothing the corners of her race bib even though it was already perfectly pinned. Jackson walked over carrying a bottle of water and a cup of black coffee. He smiled when he noticed her fixing the bib again. "That's the 6th time," Fiora laughed nervously. "Only the 6th?" Jackson handed her the water. "You've spent 2 years getting ready for today." Fiora looked toward the crowded starting line. "It still doesn't feel real." "That's because it matters." Before Fiora could answer, Hazel jogged over after finishing her warm-up. "You look terrified," she teased. Fiora shrugged. "Maybe I am," Hazel laughed. "Good, so am I." The 2 women looked toward the massive crowd gathering behind the starting banner. "Can you believe this?" Hazel asked quietly. 10 years, Fiora nodded. Tyrese used to dream about running this race. Hazel gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "Then today, you run for both of you." Fiora smiled before looking down at the faded red bracelet tied around her wrist. She gently ran her thumb across the worn threads. "For both of them," she whispered. Trayvon approached carrying Fiora's warm-up jacket. He helped her take it off before folding it neatly over his arm. "Any last advice?" Fiora asked. Trayvon smiled. "No." She looked surprised. He nodded toward the starting line. "Everything I wanted to teach you, you already learned." Jackson stepped forward and held out his fist. "No matter what happens today, we're proud of you." Fiora bumped his fist and smiled. "Thank you." Hazel stretched her arms one last time before grinning at Fiora. "Just one favor." "What's that?" "Don't make me chase you too much," Fiora laughed. "No promises." The announcer's voice thundered through the loudspeakers. "Elite runners, please report to the starting line." Conversations faded almost instantly. Thousands of athletes slowly walked toward their assigned positions. Fiora took her place beside Hazel and looked ahead at 50 kilometers of winding roads disappearing into the Blue Ridge Mountains. She closed her eyes for a brief moment and took one slow breath. "Mom, Tyrese, I'm ready." 10 seconds, the announcer shouted. The crowd erupted into cheers. 5. Fiora leaned slightly forward. 4. Her heartbeat echoed inside her ears. 3. Hazel glanced sideways and smiled. "See you at the finish," Fiora smiled back. "I'll be there." 2. Every runner became perfectly still. 1. The starting horn echoed across the mountains, and thousands of runners surged forward together as the race of a decade officially began. The opening miles passed almost exactly as Fiora expected. The leaders exploded off the starting line, fighting for position before the course narrowed into the first climb. Fiora ignored them. She settled into the pace she had practiced hundreds of times over the past 2 years. Fast enough to stay competitive, slow enough to still have something left when everyone else began to fade. Hazel, on the other hand, wasted no time moving toward the front of the pack. By the 10th kilometer, she had already worked her way into the top 5 overall. Television motorcycles followed the leaders while helicopters circled high above the Blue Ridge Mountains. Commentators couldn't stop talking about Hazel's aggressive start. Fiora's name wasn't mentioned once. Trayvon watched one of the giant screens near the finish area and smiled to himself. Jackson glanced over. "You're smiling," Trayvon nodded. "That's exactly where she wants everyone to think she belongs." 20 kilometers into the race, the first long climb began. The road twisted through the mountains, rising steadily beneath the morning sun. The runners who had started too fast began paying the price. One after another, they slowed, stretched cramped legs, or walked toward aid stations. Fiora simply kept the same rhythm she had found at the starting line. Her breathing never changed. Her stride never changed. One runner, then another. She quietly moved past them without looking sideways. Hazel remained near the front, but the gap between them slowly became smaller with every mile. By the 30-kilometer mark, only 6 women remained ahead of Fiora. Jackson refreshed the live timing app every few seconds before looking at Trayvon. "She's moving up." Trayvon never looked away from the screen. "No," he smiled softly. "Everyone else is moving backward. 35 kilometers. 5 runners ahead. 40 kilometers. Only 3 remained." The crowd along the course grew louder as word spread that an unknown runner from Asheville was climbing through the field. Television cameras finally turned toward Fiora. Sweat covered her face, and her legs looked as tired as everyone else's, but her pace never broke. Hazel heard footsteps behind her for the first time all morning. She glanced over one shoulder and smiled when she recognized Fiora. "About time," Hazel called between breaths. Fiora laughed despite the exhaustion. "You started too fast," Hazel shook her head. "Or maybe," she grinned, "you started too slow." The 2 women ran side by side as they reached the 45-kilometer marker. Neither spoke again. There wasn't enough energy left for conversation. Only 5 kilometers remained. Thousands of spectators packed both sides of the road, cheering as the 2 women disappeared toward the final stretch together. The 48th kilometer broke almost everyone. One runner grabbed her hamstring and stepped off the course. Another slowed to a walk with her head hanging low. Volunteers rushed toward exhausted athletes while spectators shouted encouragement from both sides of the road. Hazel and Fiora were now running alone. No one else remained close enough to challenge them. The finish line was still out of sight, but everyone knew the race had become a battle between the 2 women. Hazel glanced at her watch before taking a deeper breath. Then, without warning, she accelerated. Fiora watched the gap open by several strides. Every muscle in her body begged her to let Hazel go. Instead, she lowered her shoulders and matched the pace. One stride, then another. The distance between them refused to grow. "You're unbelievable," Hazel called without looking back. Fiora managed a tired smile. "You too." They climbed the final hill almost side by side before the road finally leveled out. In the distance, the finish arch appeared for the first time. The roar of thousands of spectators rolled toward them like thunder. The announcer's voice echoed across the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is unbelievable! We have 2 women leading the entire field!" The crowd erupted even louder. "No woman has ever won the overall championship in the history of this race. 50 meters! Hazel's breathing became ragged. Fiora could hear every breath beside her. 40 meters. Their shoulders were nearly even. 30 meters. Hazel dug deep and surged one last time. Fiora answered immediately. 20 meters. Every step felt as though someone had tied heavy chains around her legs. Her vision began to blur. The cheers around her slowly faded into the background. All she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. Then another sound quietly replaced it. "Come on, little sis!" Tyrese's voice. She saw him for only a heartbeat, smiling exactly as he had the day he defended her from the neighborhood boys. "You can do it!" The image disappeared as quickly as it came. Another voice followed, Mary's gentle laugh. One more step. Fiora saw her mother standing beyond the finish line, wearing the same warm smile she had worn every time she waited at the end of a training run. "I'm right here." Tears instantly filled Fiora's eyes. She didn't know whether the images were memories, imagination, or simply exhaustion. She only knew she couldn't stop now. 10 meters. Hazel looked over. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Hazel smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone trying to defeat an opponent. It was the smile of someone watching another runner give absolutely everything she had. 5 meters. Fiora found one final burst of strength she didn't know still existed. She leaned forward with every ounce of energy left in her body. The finish line rushed toward her. Then everything disappeared beneath her feet. She collapsed onto the pavement the moment she crossed it. For several seconds, she couldn't hear anything except the pounding inside her chest. Then the noise of the crowd slowly returned, louder than she had ever heard in her life. Fiora rolled onto her back and looked up at the bright blue sky above the mountains. Tears streamed freely down both sides of her face. She smiled through them and whispered in a trembling voice, "Mom, Tyrese." She closed her eyes for a moment before whispering again, "I did it." Far from the roaring crowd near the finish line, a lone man stood behind the last row of spectators with the brim of his cap pulled low over his face. His hair had turned almost completely silver over the years, and deep lines marked a face that had carried regret far longer than anyone knew. Dion never looked away from the course. Every painful step Fiora took felt like another reminder of the years he could never take back. When she stumbled slightly with less than 100 meters remaining, his heart nearly stopped. His fingers tightened together until his knuckles turned white. Tears slowly filled his eyes. "Mary," he whispered. His voice trembled. "Tyrese," he swallowed hard before speaking again. "Look at our little girl." His eyes never left Fiora. "She's almost there." He slowly lifted his head toward the sky. "God," his voice cracked. "I don't deserve to ask you for anything." He closed his eyes for only a moment. "I was a terrible husband. I was a terrible father. I destroyed the only family you ever blessed me with." His shoulders shook as another tear rolled down his face. "I've lived with that every single day." His voice became almost a whisper. "If someone still has to pay for those sins, let it be me." He took a deep, unsteady breath. "But please, please let my daughter finish this race safely." As he prayed, memories rushed through his mind one after another. He remembered standing across the street years earlier, watching Fiora jog through the park after finishing another shift at the restaurant. She had looked exhausted, yet she kept running until sunset. He remembered hiding behind a line of trees outside the cemetery, waiting until Fiora had left before quietly placing fresh flowers in front of Mary's grave. He remembered seeing Fiora laugh with Hazel after winning her first regional race and smiling to himself because it had been the first genuine smile he had seen on his daughter in years. He remembered the afternoon Mary collapsed outside the grocery store. He had been driving home when he saw her fall. He slammed on the brakes and ran across the parking lot before anyone else reached her. "Mary!" She had opened her eyes for only a second. She recognized him immediately. No anger, no hatred, only surprise. Dion held her trembling hand while waiting for the ambulance. "Stay with me," he begged. "Please." Mary gave him the faintest smile. "Take care," she whispered, struggling for every breath of her. Before Dion could answer, the paramedics rushed in and lifted her onto a stretcher. He followed the ambulance all the way to the hospital, praying the entire drive. He waited outside the emergency room until the doctor finally stepped out. One look at the doctor's face was enough. Dion didn't remember falling to his knees. He only remembered burying his face in his hands as tears poured through his fingers. "I'm sorry," he whispered over and over. "I'm so sorry." The memories disappeared as quickly as they had come. Dion looked back toward the finish line just in time to see Fiora lying on the pavement beneath the finishing arch, tears shining across her face. A broken smile slowly appeared on his own. "You kept your promise," he whispered. "Just like your mother always knew you would." For several long seconds, Fiora remained on her back, staring into the endless blue sky above the mountains. Her chest rose and fell violently as she struggled to catch her breath. The noise around her faded into a distant blur. All she could feel was the rough pavement beneath her and the red bracelet still wrapped around her wrist. Then she heard thousands of voices erupt at once. She slowly turned her head toward the giant screen hanging above the finish line. Her name filled the display, Fiora Jefferson, overall champion. Beneath it, another line appeared. first female athlete to win the Blue Ridge Endurance Marathon. The announcer could barely be heard over the deafening cheers. "History has just been made!" he shouted. For the first time since this race began, a woman has crossed the finish line ahead of the entire field. The crowd answered with another thunderous roar. Hazel, still trying to steady her own breathing after finishing only seconds behind Fiora, walked over and held out a hand. Fiora looked up through tear-filled eyes before taking it. Hazel pulled her to her feet, then wrapped her arms around her without saying a word. They stood there for several seconds while cameras flashed from every direction. Finally, Hazel leaned back, smiled, and laughed. "I guess dinner's on me," Fiora laughed through her tears. "You still owe me from Charlotte." Hazel rolled her eyes. "You're never letting that go, are you?" "Never." Both of them laughed again. A few yards away, Jackson wiped his eyes before pretending he wasn't crying. Trayvon noticed and smiled. "You can stop hiding it." Jackson let out a quiet laugh. "I'm trying." Trayvon looked back toward Fiora standing beneath the finish arch. Pride filled his eyes. "So am I." Race officials placed the championship medal around Fiora's neck before asking her to step onto the top podium. As the crowd applauded, she slowly lifted the medal into both hands. Instead of raising it above her head, she looked up toward the bright afternoon sky. Her voice was barely louder than a whisper, yet to her it felt as though the whole world could hear it. "Mum." Tears rolled freely down her face. "Tyrese," she smiled through them. "I kept my promise." A gentle breeze brushed across her face. Fiora closed her eyes for just a moment, letting herself believe they had heard every word. When she opened them again, she smiled brighter than she had in years. Far beyond the cheering crowd, Dion quietly lowered his head. A single tear slipped down his weathered face before he gently smiled to himself. He didn't step forward. He didn't call Fiora's name. He simply turned around and slowly disappeared into the crowd, carrying both his pride and his regret with him. 3 days after the Blue Ridge Endurance Marathon, Fiora returned to the cemetery, carrying a bouquet of white lilies. The excitement surrounding her historic victory had barely faded. Television interviews, newspaper headlines, and congratulatory messages continued pouring in, but none of that mattered to her today. She walked slowly along the familiar path until Mary's headstone came into view. Just like the year before, another bouquet of fresh flowers was already resting there. Fiora smiled faintly. "Looks like someone beat me here again, Mom." She stepped closer, then suddenly stopped. A man was standing quietly in front of the grave. His back faced her. His silver hair moved gently with the afternoon breeze. He didn't seem to notice her footsteps. Fiora immediately recognized him. "Dion." The man slowly turned around. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Years of silence stood between them. Dion looked older than she remembered. His shoulders had become slightly bent, and the confidence that once filled his eyes had long disappeared. He lowered his head first. "Congratulations." His voice was quiet and unsteady. "Your mother would have been so proud." Fiora looked at him without answering. Dion took a slow breath before speaking again. "I watched the race." Fiora wasn't surprised. Somehow, she had already guessed. "You've been watching for a long time, haven't you?" Dion closed his eyes for a brief moment before nodding. "Yes." "Longer than you know," silence returned. Birds sang softly somewhere among the trees. Finally, Dion spoke again. "I've practiced this conversation in my head thousands of times." He let out a bitter smile. "None of those words seem good enough now." Fiora quietly waited. "I'm sorry." The words came out almost as a whisper. "For Tyrese. For your mother. For you." Tears slowly gathered in his eyes. "There isn't a single day that I don't regret what I did." Fiora looked down at the flowers in her hands. Her fingers tightened around the stems. "Do you know," she said softly, "how many nights I wished you'd come after us?" Dion couldn't answer. "I waited." Her voice trembled. "Mom waited." She looked up at him, tears filling her own eyes now. "You never came." Dion lowered his head. "I know." Another long silence passed between them. Finally, Fiora spoke again. "I don't hate you anymore." Dion's eyes slowly lifted. But a tear rolled down Fiora's cheek. "I'm not ready to forgive you either," Dion nodded. There was no disappointment on his face, only acceptance. You don't owe me forgiveness. He gently placed the small bouquet he had brought beside Mary's headstone before taking one slow step backward. I'm just grateful you spoke to me today. Fiora looked at him one last time before kneeling in front of Mary's grave. She gently placed her flowers beside his. I'll see you next week, Mom. Dion quietly turned and walked away without looking back. This time, Fiora didn't stop him. But for the first time in nearly 20 years, she didn't watch him leave with anger either. The weeks that followed passed quietly. Neither Fiora nor Dion tried to force something that wasn't ready. They didn't suddenly become father and daughter again. Some wounds were simply too deep for that. But little by little, they began speaking again. Every other Sunday afternoon, Fiora stopped by Dion's small house on the edge of Asheville. Sometimes she brought homemade soup. Sometimes fresh bread from the bakery near her apartment. Sometimes she simply came to make sure he was eating properly. Their conversations rarely lasted more than an hour. They talked about the weather, about local races, about the children training at the academy. They never spoke about the night he forced her and Mary to leave. Not yet. One rainy afternoon, Fiora noticed an old cardboard box sitting beside Dion's bookshelf. "What's in there?" she asked. Dion hesitated before carrying it over to the coffee table. Inside were dozens of newspaper clippings, race programs, magazine articles. Every single one featured Fiora. Some had faded with age. Others were carefully laminated to keep them from wearing out. Fiora slowly picked up one of the oldest articles. It was from the small 20-kilometer race in Roanoke, where she had won her first silver medal. Another clipping showed her standing beside Hazel after a regional championship. Another showed her crossing the finish line at the Blue Ridge Endurance Marathon. Dion smiled sadly. "I never missed one." Fiora looked at him in silence. "I was always there." He looked down at his hands. "Just not where you could see me." Fiora carefully placed the newspaper back into the box. She finally understood why fresh flowers had always appeared at Mary's grave before she arrived. She finally understood why she sometimes felt as though someone was watching from far away after races. Dion had never stopped being her father. He had simply believed he no longer deserved to stand beside her. Before leaving that afternoon, Fiora stopped at the front door. Her hand rested on the doorknob for a long moment. Then she quietly turned around. "I'll come back next Sunday," Dion smiled gently. "I'll make coffee," Fiora nodded. "And don't forget to eat breakfast first." Dion laughed softly. "Yes, ma'am." Fiora couldn't help smiling. As she walked toward her car, she realized something had changed. She still wasn't ready to call him Dad. She still couldn't erase the past. But for the first time in many years, visiting him no longer felt like reopening an old wound. It felt like taking the first step toward healing. Spring quietly turned into summer. With every passing month, the academy welcomed more children. Some came to become better runners. Others came simply because it was the first place where someone believed in them. Fiora spent nearly every afternoon on the track, moving from one group to another with a stopwatch hanging around her neck. Trayvon was almost always nearby, helping younger runners improve their endurance while Jackson handled registrations, sponsorships, and the growing mountain of paperwork. One evening, after the last group had gone home, the stadium finally fell silent. The sun was slowly disappearing behind the Blue Ridge Mountains as Fiora gathered the training cones scattered across the field. Trayvon walked over carrying 2 bottles of water and handed one to her. "Long day?" he asked. Fiora smiled. "The best kind." They sat side by side on the empty bleachers, watching the sky turn shades of orange and purple. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Trayvon broke the silence. "Can I tell you something?" Fiora turned toward him. "Of course." Trayvon let out a quiet laugh. "I've rehearsed this conversation so many times that none of it sounds right anymore," Fiora smiled. "That sounds familiar," Trayvon nodded. "I've wanted to tell you this for years." He looked out across the empty track before continuing. "Not when you won your first race. Not after Blue Ridge. Not because you became famous." He slowly turned to face her. "I fell in love with the woman who kept running after 12-hour shifts because she refused to give up on a dream." Fiora remained quiet, listening. "I fell in love with the daughter who spent every spare dollar taking care of her mother before spending a single dollar on herself." His voice softened. "I fell in love with the coach who now gives children the same chance she once wished someone would give her." He smiled gently. "That's the woman I love." Fiora lowered her eyes for a moment before laughing quietly to herself. "You know, Trayvon looked at her. Hazel has been teasing me for almost a year. Trayvon raised an eyebrow. About what? She kept saying you looked at me differently than everyone else. Trayvon laughed and shook his head. I should have known she'd figure it out, Fiora smiled. She told me I was the only person who couldn't see it. Both of them laughed. When the laughter faded, Fiora looked at Trayvon with the same calm smile she had worn throughout the evening. You waited a long time, Trayvon nodded. You had too much to heal from. Fiora reached over and gently took his hand. Thank you, she said softly, for waiting until I was ready. Trayvon squeezed her hand gently. So, he smiled nervously. Is that a yes? Fiora laughed. I thought that was obvious. Trayvon smiled wider than she had ever seen before. As the last light disappeared behind the mountains, the two of them remained sitting together on the empty bleachers, hands intertwined, watching the running track where Fiora's impossible dream had first begun to become reality. A year later, on a warm autumn afternoon, family and friends gathered beneath a row of old oak trees overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains. White chairs lined both sides of a narrow stone walkway covered with flower petals. It wasn't a grand wedding, and neither Fiora nor Trayvon wanted one. They only wanted the people who had stood beside them through the hardest years of their lives. Soft music began to play as everyone rose to their feet. Jackson, serving as Trayvon's best man, quietly adjusted his tie for what felt like the 10th time. Trayvon laughed under his breath. You're making me nervous, Jackson smiled. You're the one getting married. Trayvon shook his head. You look more anxious than I am. Before Jackson could answer, every conversation faded. Fiora appeared at the end of the aisle wearing a simple white wedding dress. There were no diamonds around her neck, no expensive jewelry on her hands. The only thing she wore besides her wedding ring was the faded red bracelet Mary had tied around her wrist years ago. Hazel smiled the moment she noticed it. I knew she'd wear it. Fiora slowly walked toward the altar, smiling at the familiar faces lining both sides of the aisle. Children from the academy waved excitedly. Former teammates applauded quietly. Missers. Henderson wiped away a tear from the front row. Then Fiora's eyes met Dion's. He sat quietly near the back wearing an old dark suit that looked as though it had been carefully pressed for days. He smiled gently as she passed. It wasn't the smile of a man expecting forgiveness. It was the smile of a father grateful simply to witness a day he never thought he would live to see. A few minutes later, the officiant looked at the couple with a warm smile. By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Applause and cheers filled the hillside as Trayvon gently kissed Fiora. Hazel whistled louder than anyone else, making everyone burst into laughter. While the celebration continued around him, Dion quietly slipped a hand inside his suit jacket. From the inside pocket, he carefully removed an old photograph. It was the wedding picture of himself and Mary, its edges faded and worn after being carried with him for so many years. He gently brushed his thumb across Mary's smiling face before lifting his eyes toward Fiora. Tears slowly gathered in the corners of his eyes, but this time they weren't only tears of regret. They were tears of peace. A faint smile appeared on his face as he whispered so softly that only he could hear it. She looks just like you did that day, Mary. He carefully folded the photograph and slipped it back into his pocket before standing with everyone else, applauding as his daughter and her husband walked back down the aisle together, surrounded by the people who loved them. 2 years passed after the wedding. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm that Fiora had once believed she would never have. The academy continued to grow, welcoming more children every season. Trayvon spent his mornings coaching endurance groups while Fiora worked with younger runners who were just beginning their journey. One rainy evening, Trayvon rushed through the front door carrying a small overnight bag. Jackson was already waiting beside the car with the engine running. Come on, Jackson said with a grin. Your son's not going to wait forever. Trayvon laughed nervously before climbing into the passenger seat. I coached athletes through national championships, and somehow this feels scarier. Jackson smiled as he pulled away from the house. That's because this one's going to change your life. Several hours later, Trayvon quietly pushed open the hospital room door. Fiora looked up from the bed, tired but smiling brighter than he had ever seen before. Resting peacefully in her arms was a tiny baby wrapped in a light blue blanket. Trayvon slowly walked closer, afraid even to breathe too loudly. Can I? He asked softly. Fiora nodded. He carefully lifted the baby into his arms. The little boy opened his eyes for only a moment before falling asleep again. Trayvon couldn't stop smiling. He's perfect. Fiora gently reached over and touched the baby's tiny hand. Have you thought about his name? Trayvon asked. Fiora looked at her son for a long moment before answering. I have, she smiled through tears beginning to gather in her eyes. His name is Tyrese. Trayvon looked at her without saying a word. He didn't ask why. He already knew. He simply nodded. I think he'd be proud. Fiora leaned back against the pillow and looked out the hospital window. He was the first person who ever made me believe I could become someone. She looked back at the sleeping baby. I want our son to grow up carrying that same kindness. Trayvon gently kissed the baby's forehead before handing him back to Fiora. Later that afternoon, Dion quietly stepped into the room carrying a small stuffed bear. He stopped the moment he saw the baby's name written on the hospital bassinet, Tyrese Smith. He stood silently for several seconds before tears slowly filled his eyes. Fiora noticed him and smiled gently. Would you like to meet your grandson? Dion nodded, unable to speak. He slowly walked over and looked down at the sleeping baby. His hand trembled slightly as he gently touched the baby's tiny fingers. A tear rolled down his cheek before he quietly whispered, Welcome to the family, little Tyrese. For the first time in many years, the room no longer felt weighed down by loss. It felt filled with new beginnings. The years passed quietly. The academy that had once started with only a handful of children slowly grew into one of the most respected youth endurance programs in North Carolina. Every afternoon, the sound of running shoes filled the track while laughter echoed across the training field. Some children dreamed of becoming professional athletes. Others simply came because someone finally believed in them. One evening after practice, Fiora and Trayvon stood together watching the last group finish their cool-down laps. Trayvon smiled. We're running out of space, Fiora laughed. That's a good problem to have. She watched dozens of children talking excitedly as they headed toward the parking lot. I never imagined this many kids would show up. Trayvon looked at her. You gave them something you never had growing up, Fiora smiled quietly. Someone who believed in them. A few days later, Fiora drove to Dion's small house carrying dinner, as she had done so many times before. She found him sitting alone on the front porch, watching the sunset. His hair had turned completely white now, and climbing the front steps had become slower than it once was. Fiora sat beside him without saying anything for a while. Finally, she broke the silence. I've been thinking, Dion smiled. That usually means I'm about to be asked to do something. Fiora laughed. Probably. She turned toward him. The academy keeps getting bigger, Dion nodded. I've noticed. The kids need more people around them. Dion listened quietly. Fiora took a slow breath before continuing. Tyrese is getting older. The academy is getting busier. And, she smiled gently, I don't like you living here by yourself anymore. Dion looked at her, surprised. Fiora reached over and placed her hand on his. Come live with us, Dion didn't answer. For a long moment, he simply stared at her as though he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. You'd have your own room, Fiora continued softly. Tyrese already asks about Grandpa every week. A small laugh escaped Dion before tears quietly filled his eyes. Are you sure? Fiora nodded. Very sure. He looked down at their hands. They remained there for several seconds before he slowly covered hers with his other hand. His voice trembled. Thank you, Fiora smiled. One more thing, Dion looked up. The academy could use another coach. He blinked in surprise. Me? Fiora nodded. You've forgotten more about discipline than most people ever learn, she laughed. Besides, someone has to keep those stubborn kids in line. Dion laughed through his tears. I think I know a thing or two about stubborn children. Fiora raised an eyebrow with a playful smile. You definitely do, both of them laughed. It was the easiest conversation they had shared in decades. A month later, Dion moved into the small guest house beside Fiora and Trayvon's home. Every morning, little Tyrese ran across the yard shouting, Grandpa, before jumping into his arms. Every afternoon, Dion sat beside the running track, patiently teaching children how to warm up properly, how to stay disciplined, and how to respect every runner they competed against. Not long after, Hazel officially joined the academy as a full-time coach. She focused on speed training while Trayvon handled endurance. Fiora mentored young athletes, and Dion quietly watched over them all from the sidelines. Sometimes, as he looked across the track filled with children chasing impossible dreams, he found himself smiling. For the first time in his life, home finally felt like home again. More than 20 years passed. The academy had become a second home for hundreds of children from across western North Carolina. Some arrived with expensive running shoes and years of training behind them. Others showed up with worn-out sneakers and nothing but determination. Fiora welcomed every one of them the same way. "All right, everyone," she called, raising her whistle. "3 more laps before we cool down." Dozens of children burst forward, laughing as they raced around the track. Trayvon coached one group through endurance drills while Hazel corrected another group's running form. A few yards away, Dion sat beneath the shade of an old oak tree, smiling as little Tyrese proudly demonstrated warm-up exercises to younger children. Fiora watched them for a moment before turning back toward the track. That was when she noticed him. A skinny little boy stood quietly behind the chain-link fence. His clothes looked worn, and his shoes were several sizes too big. He wasn't watching the coaches. He wasn't watching the parents. His eyes never left the children running around the track. For a brief moment, Fiora felt as though she were looking at herself more than 40 years earlier. The boy noticed her looking at him. Embarrassed, he quickly lowered his head and turned to leave. "Hey!" Fiora called. "Wait a second!" The boy froze before slowly turning around. He looked nervous as Fiora walked over with a gentle smile. "What's your name?" "Akeem," he answered quietly. Fiora nodded. "Do you like running?" Akeem looked through the fence toward the children on the track. "I watch every marathon on TV," he admitted. "They're amazing." A small smile appeared on his face before quickly disappearing again. "I wish I could do that someday." Fiora noticed the hesitation in his voice. "So why don't you?" Akeem looked down at his oversized shoes. "I'm too small," he shrugged. "And my mom works 2 jobs. We can't afford coaching or equipment." He forced a quiet laugh. "People like me don't become champions." Fiora remained silent for a moment. Every word sounded painfully familiar. She had once believed those exact same things. She smiled gently and rested a hand on the fence between them. "The most important thing isn't how much money you have." Akeem slowly looked up. "It isn't how strong you are today," she smiled. "It's whether you have the courage to keep showing up tomorrow." The little boy listened without blinking. Fiora nodded toward the running track behind her. "If you really want something, you'll always find a reason to keep chasing it," she smiled warmly. "I'm here every day. If you ever need me, come find me." Akeem stared at her for several seconds before a hopeful smile slowly appeared across his face. "Really?" Fiora nodded. "Really?" She held out her hand. "I'll be waiting." Akeem smiled, gave a small nod, then slowly walked away with one last glance toward the track. Fiora watched him disappear down the sidewalk before quietly smiling to herself. 40 years earlier, someone had believed in a frightened little girl who thought she wasn't good enough. Today, it was her turn to believe in someone else. Behind her, the whistle sounded once more as another group of children crossed the finish line. Fiora turned around, smiled, and walked back toward the track where a new generation of dreams had already begun.